There is a moment, somewhere in the grey silence of the North Atlantic, where a ship stops being a machine and becomes something else entirely, where steel and oil and riveted plate become a symbol of power, of pride, of the terrible distance between what men believe and what the sea decides. This is a story about that moment. It begins not with a battle, but with a problem. The year is 1941. Germany controls most of continental Europe. Her armies have swept across France, across the Low Countries, deep into North Africa. On paper, the Third Reich has never appeared stronger. But beneath that surface confidence, a quiet strangling is underway. Britain, battered, exhausted, but unbroken, controls the Atlantic. And the Atlantic is everything. It carries the fuel, the food, the steel, the weapons that keep Britain fighting. Without it, the war in the West continues. Without it, the clock never runs out on Churchill's government. Without it, Germany's continental dominance means almost nothing. The men who run the German Navy understand this with a clarity that sometimes becomes desperation. Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, watches the months pile up. He watches the British blockade tighten. He watches his submarine force struggle against convoy escorts, his surface raiders track down one by one, his strategic options narrow with each passing season. He needs something dramatic, something that changes the equation, something so powerful, so fast, so overwhelming that the British cannot simply respond, something that forces them to divert, to hesitate, to bleed. He has just the ship. She was built at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg, launched in the spring of 1939, commissioned 2 years later. She displaces more than 41,000 tons at full combat load. Her belt armor runs to more than 300 millimeters of hardened steel at her widest sections. She carries 8 15-inch guns arranged in 4 twin turrets, weapons capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 800 kilograms across distances most men cannot even picture. She can sustain speeds exceeding 30 knots, fast enough to run from almost anything she cannot outfight, powerful enough to destroy almost anything she cannot outrun. Her name is Bismarck. And in the spring of 1941, the German Admiralty decides to send her into the Atlantic. Alongside her sails the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, smaller, faster, armed with 8-inch guns, crewed by professionals who know their business. Together, they represent the most powerful surface raiding force Germany has ever deployed. The plan carries a name in the Kriegsmarine's precise operational language: Operation Rheinübung, Operation Rhine exercise. The code suggests something almost routine, a training problem, a maneuver. What it actually represents is one of the most audacious naval gambles of the entire Second World War. Raeder's theory is straightforward: send Bismarck and Prinz Eugen into the Atlantic convoy routes. Merchant ships are slow, weakly armed, and dependent on British escort vessels that cannot hope to match Bismarck's firepower. Let her loose among them, and the damage will not simply be material. It will be psychological. Convoy commodores will hesitate. Routes will have to change. British warships, already stretched thin across multiple theatres, will have to concentrate against a single threat, leaving other responsibilities uncovered. The operation is not designed to win the war in a single sortie. It is designed to make the cost of the Atlantic so unbearably high that something has to give. It is a logical plan. In many ways, it is a brilliant one. It will last 5 days at sea, and in those 5 days, more than 3,000 men from 2 navies will die. The most celebrated warship in the German fleet, will be sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. The most beloved ship in the Royal Navy, a vessel that carried the weight of an empire's pride, will vanish in less than 4 minutes. A captain will choose fire over surrender. An admiral will never send another message. Survivors will float in oil-blackened water for hours, waiting for rescue that comes too slowly, too late for most of them. By the time it ends, the world will have changed. Not dramatically, not with the visible lurch of a turning point that everyone recognizes in the moment, but changed nonetheless, quietly, irreversibly. The age in which great battleships could roam the open ocean as kings, that age will have closed. The navy that built Bismarck will never send another capital ship into the Atlantic in force. The strategists who believed that sheer mechanical power could substitute for air cover, for logistical depth, for realistic strategic objectives, they will have learned their lesson at a cost that cannot be refunded. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before any of that can happen, before the shells and the smoke and the oil and the cold, there is the ship, and she is extraordinary. She is 250 meters of precision German engineering. She has a crew of more than 2,000 men, many of them young, many of them proud, most of them genuinely convinced that what they are sailing is the finest fighting vessel afloat. They have reasons for that belief. The world has given them reasons. When Bismarck entered service, neutral observers, naval attachés, journalists, technical analysts used language that bordered on awe. Her combination of speed, firepower, and protection seemed to violate the usual compromises that naval architects are forced to accept. She did not appear to have a weakness. She had weaknesses. She always had weaknesses. Every ship does. But in the spring of 1941, confidence is high in Kiel and Hamburg and Berlin. The operation will succeed, the admirals tell themselves. The Atlantic will feel the weight of German ambition. The convoys will scatter. The British will have no answer. In London, a different set of admirals is already working on the answer. What follows over the next hours of this documentary is the complete story of Operation Rheinübung, from the strategic desperation that conceived it, through the engineering triumph that built its centerpiece, through the breakout, the battle, the chase, the long silences of open ocean, the brief terrifying moments of contact, the crippled rudder that sealed a fate, the final morning, the final guns, and the long accounting that came after. This is not a story about villains or heroes, though both appear. It is a story about men, German and British, officers and ratings, engineers and gunners, and signals operators and survivors, caught inside an operation that quickly became something none of them had planned for. It is a story about what happens when the gap between what a weapon is designed to do and what the real world allows closes, suddenly and without mercy. If you are settling in for the night, you have chosen well. This one runs long, because the story deserves the space. Pour whatever you need. Get comfortable. The North Atlantic in May of 1941 is cold and grey and enormous, and you are about to spend some time there. If this is your first time finding this channel, consider staying. We build these documentaries to last, to give you something worth returning to when the night gets long and quiet. Subscribe if the history matters to you. There is more where this is coming from. But for now, the year is 1941. The war is 20 months old, and somewhere in a Hamburg shipyard, a very large, very dangerous ship is preparing to go to sea. Her crew believes she is unsinkable. The ocean has heard that before. By the early months of 1941, the war at sea had become a slow, grinding emergency for the Third Reich. Britain stood unconquered across the Channel, sustained by a lifeline of ships crossing the Atlantic in relentless, grinding convoys. Steel, oil, grain, ammunition, everything the island needed to survive and to fight flowed westward through grey water and bitter weather, escorted by destroyers, watched over by flying boats, and shepherded by the collective will of a nation that understood, at some fundamental level, that the moment those convoys stopped, the war was effectively over. Germany understood this too, and it was from this understanding, urgent, uncomfortable, and growing more pressing with every passing week, that the plan known as Operation Rheinübung was born. The German surface fleet, the Kriegsmarine, had entered the war with ambitions that outran its tonnage. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, its commanding officer, was a methodical, serious-minded officer who believed in the power of capital ships deployed aggressively against Britain's maritime commerce. He had watched the Battle of the Atlantic develop with a sailor's eye for vulnerability. The British convoy system was vast and sprawling, stretching from the American eastern seaboard to the ports of Liverpool and Glasgow, and no navy in the world could cover every stretch of it completely. Every gap was an opportunity. Every storm that grounded aircraft was a window. Raeder believed, with a conviction that went beyond optimism into something close to strategic faith, that a powerful enough surface raider could exploit those gaps and those windows, and that the cumulative loss of merchant tonnage might eventually throttle Britain's capacity to wage war. What made Raeder's position difficult, genuinely, structurally difficult, was the political environment in which he operated. Adolf Hitler had what can only be described as a deeply ambivalent relationship with the German surface fleet. He admired its symbolic power, the sheer visual authority of a battleship at sea, the statement it made about German technical mastery and national prestige. But he feared its loss with an anxiety that bordered on obsession. Every capital ship represented years of industrial effort, enormous sums of money, and, perhaps most importantly in Hitler's calculus, enormous propaganda value. To lose one was not merely a military setback, it was a blow to the image of German invincibility that the regime spent enormous energy cultivating. Raeder had to manage this fear constantly, presenting his plans in terms that emphasized opportunity while quietly minimizing the risks that Hitler found most disturbing. The previous year had offered both encouragement and caution in roughly equal measure. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper had operated in the Atlantic with modest but genuine success, demonstrating that fast, well-armed surface ships could in fact reach the convoy lanes and disrupt them. More dramatically, the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, operating together under the codename Operation Berlin, had sailed through the Atlantic in the early months of 1941 and sent a genuine tremor through the British Admiralty. Under Admiral Günther Lütjens, those two ships had ranged widely, sinking or capturing more than 20 merchant vessels over the course of roughly 2 months. The operation had demonstrated exactly what Raeder believed, that capital ships in the open ocean could cause damage far disproportionate to their numbers. The British had been forced to scramble, to divert escorts, to reconfigure convoy routing, and to expend enormous resources hunting ships that had already slipped away. But those earlier operations had also revealed a persistent frustration. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had repeatedly declined to engage the heavier escorts protecting British convoys, understandably, given their orders to avoid serious damage, and this caution had cost them opportunities. Lütjens had been criticized, at least in private Kriegsmarine circles, for excessive timidity in the face of opportunity. The lesson Raeder drew from this was not that surface raiding was inherently flawed, but that it needed to be attempted with a ship powerful enough to defeat any escort it encountered, not merely fast enough to escape one. What the Atlantic required was not a raider that ran from battleships. It required a ship that could fight them. That ship was the Bismarck. She was not yet a year out of her commissioning, and her reputation had grown in the telling until it occupied a space somewhere between naval vessel and national myth. The figures attached to her were genuinely extraordinary: displacement, firepower, speed, armor protection, and they had been communicated with a pride that sometimes blurred into propaganda. Within the Kriegsmarine, there were officers who regarded this enthusiasm with professional skepticism, who understood that reputation and reality did not always coincide, and who knew that the Royal Navy was not going to obligingly confirm German press releases. But the institutional momentum behind deploying the Bismarck was powerful, and Raeder rode it with deliberate purpose. The plan that emerged, Rheinübung, meaning Rhine exercise, was characteristically bold in conception and complicated in execution. The Bismarck would sail with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen as her companion, break out into the Atlantic through the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland, and then operate against the convoy routes with a freedom that no previous German surface force had quite managed. The combination was calculated. Bismarck could overwhelm any escort, while Prinz Eugen's speed and modern equipment made her ideal for scouting ahead, identifying targets, and conducting independent raids while Bismarck covered the approach. Together they would present the Royal Navy with a dilemma: concentrate against the battleship and leave the cruiser free, or split forces and risk both tasks failing. It was, on a chart in a German naval headquarters, an elegant concept. What the plan required, above all, was surprise and speed. The Denmark Strait was not the only route into the Atlantic, but it was the northernmost, and in certain weather conditions, fog, heavy seas, it offered a passage that could be run quickly and with a reasonable chance of avoiding sustained contact with British patrol vessels. Once into the open ocean, the German ships would have the entire Atlantic to maneuver in, and British convoys, however well organized, could not be everywhere. Raeder and his staff believed the operation had a genuine chance of success, and they believed further that even if the material damage it inflicted was limited, the disruption it caused, the convoys delayed, the escorts diverted, the Admiralty forced to respond, would carry strategic value beyond the tonnage of any ships actually sunk. There was, of course, a dimension to all of this that never appeared explicitly in operational planning documents, but hung over every meeting and every decision. The United States was not yet in the war. In the early months of 1941, American neutrality was formal but increasingly strained, and American ships were already playing a quiet but meaningful role in the protection of Atlantic convoys. A German battleship loose in the convoy lanes would create pressure of a different kind: political pressure, diplomatic pressure, the pressure that comes from threatening the logistical foundation upon which Britain's resistance rested. Raeder was too careful an officer to articulate this dimension openly, but it informed the ambition behind Rheinübung, the sense that a successful Atlantic operation might accomplish something beyond the merely naval. To make the plan work, timing was everything. The German ships needed to sail during a period of poor weather over the Denmark Strait, when British reconnaissance aircraft would struggle to maintain contact. They needed to move quickly before Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, currently in Brest, undergoing repairs, could be ready to join them as additional diversionary forces. They needed supply ships to be pre-positioned across the Atlantic, waiting in remote anchorages to refuel the raiders and extend their operational endurance. The logistics of the plan were extensive and required coordination across multiple arms of the naval staff. That coordination began quietly, in the way that large operations always begin, through paperwork, through requisitions, through orders that did not yet reveal their full purpose. For the men who would sail on Bismarck and Prinz Eugen, the operation was known only in fragments. Sailors understood that something was being prepared, that the ships were being loaded and provisioned beyond routine needs, that officers were consulting charts of waters far from the Baltic exercises they had grown accustomed to. There was excitement in that uncertainty, the particular electricity that runs through a crew when it begins to sense that the routine is ending and something larger is beginning. Bismarck's captain, Ernst Lindemann, was a precise, competent, and genuinely capable officer who inspired both confidence and respect in the men under his command. He understood the ship well, and the ship was extraordinary. That combination, professional skill, extraordinary machine, produced a crew that believed in what it was part of. Raeder presented the final operation plan to Hitler in April of 1941, with the careful framing he had developed over years of managing his commander's anxieties. The operation was an opportunity. The Bismarck was powerful enough to handle whatever the British might send. The rewards, in disrupted convoys and demonstrated German naval reach, would be significant. Hitler approved, though not without misgivings he barely concealed. He worried about the risks, about air cover, about the possibility that the Royal Navy might respond more quickly and more forcefully than the plan anticipated. Those worries were noted, acknowledged, and set aside. The operation would proceed. In the harbours of the Baltic and the Norwegian coast, ships were made ready. The North Atlantic waited, cold, vast, and indifferent to the ambitions of either side. Before a single gun was loaded, before a single order was given at sea, she had to be built, and the building of her was itself a statement, not merely of engineering capability, but of national intent. The Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg had constructed warships for decades, but when the keel of the vessel that would become the Bismarck was laid down in the summer of 1936, the yard's workers understood they were handling something different in kind. The contracts were enormous. The steel was the finest available. The specifications demanded tolerances that pushed German industrial capacity to its outer limits. Men who had spent careers riveting hulls together later recalled that there was a different atmosphere about this particular construction, a quiet, almost reverent seriousness that settled over the slipway as the hull began to rise. This was not an ordinary commission. This was the argument Germany intended to make to the world, expressed in metal and fire. She was named after Otto von Bismarck, the 19th century statesman who had forged a unified German nation through calculated force and political will. The choice was deliberate. The name carried weight. It carried a specific kind of authority, the authority of the man who believed that great questions were settled not by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. To attach that name to a battleship was to make a declaration about what Germany believed naval power meant, and the ship herself seemed designed to justify the name. When she was launched in February of 1939, she displaced more than 41,000 tons of water, a figure that on its own conveyed very little until you stood beside the hull and understood what 41,000 tons actually looked like rising above you. She was roughly 250 meters from bow to stern, broad-beamed and purposeful, carrying herself with a kind of institutional confidence that steel structures rarely manage. Her primary armament was built around 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft, each housing a pair of guns with a caliber of 38 centimeters, what the British would call 15-inch guns. These were not the largest naval guns ever fitted to a warship, but they were among the most capable. Each gun barrel extended roughly 18 meters in length. Each shell weighed approximately 800 kilograms. When those guns fired together in a broadside, the concussive force was sufficient to shatter glass in buildings on shore during trial exercises. The sound alone, described by those who witnessed full-caliber test firing, was less a bang than a physical event, a wall of compressed air that hit a man in the chest before the sound itself fully registered. 8 such barrels, capable of firing at ranges exceeding 20 kilometers, gave the Bismarck a destructive capacity that few surface vessels in any fleet could match. Beneath the thunderous primary armament lay a secondary battery designed for a different kind of fight. 12 guns of 150 millimeters provided heavy anti-surface firepower against destroyers and cruisers. Beyond those, the ship carried a bristling array of anti-aircraft weapons, a recognition, even in her original design, that the age of aircraft carriers would demand that surface ships defend themselves from above. This tiered armament architecture reflected the thinking of German naval planners who understood that the Bismarck would rarely fight in isolation. She needed to suppress torpedo boat attacks while simultaneously engaging capital ships. She needed to defend herself against aircraft. She needed, in effect, to be capable of fighting the entire spectrum of naval threats simultaneously. Whether that ambition translated perfectly into practice would become a different question. On paper, and in the minds of those who built her, it was a formidable theoretical capability. Her armor was what set her apart from nearly every other warship of her era in terms of raw protection. German naval architects had developed what they called an all-or-nothing armor philosophy, applied with particular aggression. The main belt of armor running along her waterline reached a thickness of over 320 millimeters at its deepest point, thick enough to defeat the direct strikes of most contemporary naval shells at combat ranges. Her deck armor, designed to resist plunging fire at long range, was layered in an arrangement that forced any penetrating shell to travel through multiple resistant surfaces before reaching vital machinery. Her turrets were capped with roof armor more than 180 millimeters thick. The total weight of armor material fitted to Bismarck accounted for roughly 40% of her displacement, a proportion that reflected an almost philosophical commitment to survivability. The Germans were building a ship they genuinely believed could sustain punishment that would destroy any opponent. This belief was not naive. It was grounded in rigorous calculation. The naval architects at Blohm and Voss had run thousands of design iterations to optimize the placement and thickness of protective steel. They had studied the lessons of the First World War, particularly the catastrophic losses of British battle cruisers at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, where ships with insufficient deck armor had been torn apart by plunging shells falling from high trajectories. The Bismarck was specifically designed so that this would not happen to her. Her underwater protection, the anti-torpedo bulges and internal subdivisions below the waterline, was similarly elaborate. The hull was divided into a large number of watertight compartments so that a torpedo or shell strike flooding one section would not cascade into adjacent spaces. In theory, she could absorb multiple torpedo hits without reaching a point of uncontrolled flooding. That theory would eventually be tested under the worst possible conditions. Her propulsion was matched to her ambition. 4 sets of steam turbines drove 3 propeller shafts, generating a combined output of roughly 138,000 shaft horsepower. This drove her to sustained speeds exceeding 30 knots, faster than most battleships of her generation, fast enough to choose when and whether to engage an opponent, fast enough to run from anything she could not destroy. Speed in naval warfare is not simply a performance metric. It is a strategic dimension, a ship that can dictate the terms of its own engagement, closing when it wishes, disengaging when it chooses, holds a fundamental advantage over one that cannot. The German naval planners understood this. They had built not merely a heavily armed fortress, but a mobile one. The combination of offensive power, protective armor, and sustained speed was intended to make Bismarck nearly impossible to defeat in single-ship combat. Her fire control systems represented some of the most advanced technology Germany had produced. Optical rangefinders in armored director towers on her superstructure fed data to mechanical computing instruments, what naval engineers of the era called fire control tables, which continuously calculated the firing solutions needed to place shells on a moving target at changing ranges. The system corrected for wind, for the ship's own motion, for the target's estimated course and speed, and for the curvature of shell trajectories at extreme ranges. Gunnery officers trained for years on systems like these, developing an almost intuitive feel for how the instruments behaved and where their outputs needed human correction. In the Denmark Strait, within hours of her first real combat, these systems would demonstrate precisely how accurate they could be, with consequences that shook the British Empire to its foundations. The man who commanded her carried his own particular weight. Ernst Lindemann was not a figure given to dramatic speeches or theatrical gestures. He was a naval officer of the methodical, technically proficient school, someone who had built a career on precision and reliability. He knew his ship intimately. He had overseen aspects of her working-up exercises, the extended sea trials in the Baltic, during which a new warship's systems were tested, corrected, and tested again. He believed in the Bismarck's capabilities with a confidence that was professional rather than emotional, the confidence of a man who had read every specification sheet, witnessed every test result, and walked every compartment. His crew of more than 2,000 men picked up on that confidence. Sailors understand their commander's relationship with the ship he commands, and Lindemann's relationship with the Bismarck was one of deep, informed respect. The crew themselves were the product of years of German naval expansion and training. Germany had been building its navy in earnest since the mid-1930s, recruiting and educating a generation of sailors who had grown up understanding that their country intended to return to serious naval competition. The men who served aboard Bismarck were young, well-trained, and profoundly proud of their assignment. To serve on the newest and most powerful capital ship in the German fleet was not a routine posting. It was the kind of assignment men spoke of to their families with a particular kind of quiet pride, not boasting exactly, but the dignified acknowledgement of having been entrusted with something exceptional. This pride was not misplaced. The ship was exceptional. What no one aboard her could fully know was what exceptional would ultimately cost. The confidence that suffused the Bismarck from her first sea trials was real, and it was not groundless. She was, by almost any objective measure, the most formidable warship Germany had ever built, and one of the most formidable then operating in any ocean. Her engineering represented the accumulated knowledge of a naval tradition stretching back decades, applied with post-war urgency and industrial seriousness to produce something genuinely new. The admirals who planned Operation Rheinübung built their entire strategic logic around her existence, around the premise that a ship this powerful, accompanied by a capable cruiser, could do things in the Atlantic that no force the British could quickly assemble would be able to stop. They were not wrong about the ship. Where the plan would unravel was in the gap between what the Bismarck was in harbour, gleaming and complete, and what she became the moment she moved into seas already controlled by an opponent willing to spend whatever it took to destroy her. There is a particular kind of burden that comes with standing beside greatness. Not the burden of failure, not the weight of defeat, but something quieter and more persistent. The knowledge that no matter how well you perform, how precisely you execute, how courageously you fight, the eyes of history will always drift past you toward the figure standing at your shoulder. The Prinz Eugen carried that burden from the moment she was assigned to Operation Rheinübung. She was not a second-rate ship. She was not a compromise or a concession. She was, by every objective measure, one of the most capable and sophisticated warships the German Navy had ever put to sea. And yet, from her first day alongside the Bismarck, she was the shadow companion, present, essential, and perpetually overlooked. She had been laid down in the mid-1930s at the Germania shipyard in Kiel, a product of the same surge of rearmament ambition that was reshaping the German military from its roots. Named after a celebrated prince of the Habsburg dynasty, she carried a heritage that suggested elegance, precision, and a certain aristocratic confidence. Her hull displaced roughly 14,000 tons at full load, substantial by any standard, though considerably less than half the mass of the battleship she would accompany. She measured close to 212 meters from bow to stern, sleek and purposeful in profile, with a silhouette that could, under certain conditions of light and distance, be mistaken for the Bismarck herself. That resemblance was not entirely accidental. The two ships shared certain design characteristics, a kinship of geometry that the Germans would eventually turn to their advantage in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Her armament was built around 8 20.3-centimeter guns, arranged in 4 twin turrets, the heavy cruiser's standard answer to the question of how much firepower a vessel of her size could reasonably carry. These were not token weapons. They fired shells weighing over 120 kilograms at targets more than 18 kilometers distant, and at the rate of fire her trained crews could sustain, they represented a genuinely lethal threat to any vessel short of a heavily armored capital ship. She also carried 12 torpedo tubes, a secondary battery of anti-aircraft guns, and the full array of sensors and range-finding equipment that modern naval warfare demanded. She could make over 32 knots in favorable conditions, fast enough to outrun nearly anything that could outgun her, and well armed enough to threaten nearly anything that could outrun her. In isolation, she would have been a formidable raider. In the company of the Bismarck, she became something more complex, a force multiplier assigned to a role that demanded she subordinate her own considerable capabilities to a larger strategic purpose. That purpose was, at its core, reconnaissance and opportunity. The plan drawn up for Operation Rheinübung assigned the Bismarck the role of primary combatant, the ship that would hold off or destroy any Royal Navy warship attempting to interfere with the raiding mission. The Prinz Eugen's role was different. She would range ahead or to the flanks, her speed and agility allowing her to locate convoys, assess threats, and report back. If conditions allowed, she would strike independently at merchant shipping, while the Bismarck kept the escorts occupied. It was a doctrine that had worked, at least partially, for the German Navy before. The heavy cruiser, as a swift, predatory extension of the battleship's reach, operating in the spaces where a larger vessel could not follow. In theory, the combination made each ship more effective than either could be alone. In practice, the relationship was never quite equal, and everyone involved understood that. The man assigned to command the Prinz Eugen was Captain Helmuth Brinkmann, and he was, in almost every respect, the kind of officer the German Navy at its best was capable of producing. He was methodical without being rigid, confident without the brittleness that sometimes came with confidence, and possessed of the particular quality that distinguishes competent officers from genuinely skilled ones, the ability to read a situation not just as it is, but as it is likely to become. He had come up through the traditional path, accumulating the kind of experience that could not be taught in any classroom: watchkeeping in difficult seas, navigation in poor visibility, the management of men who are cold and tired and wondering whether their officers actually know what they are doing. He arrived at his command of the Prinz Eugen with a reputation for steadiness, and the crew that served under him reflected those qualities back at him. That crew numbered somewhere above 1,400 officers and enlisted men, drawn from across Germany's naval establishment. Many of them were young. The Kriegsmarine, like every armed service that expands rapidly in wartime, could not always fill its billets with seasoned veterans. But youth and inexperience are not the same thing as incompetence, and the Prinz Eugen's company had trained hard through the Baltic exercises that preceded the operation. Her gunnery teams had practiced until accuracy became reflex rather than effort. Her engineering department knew their machinery with the intimacy that comes from long hours in confined spaces with complicated equipment and very little margin for error. Her damage control parties had run through their drills until procedure was second nature. If she was not the most battle-hardened ship in the German fleet, few ships were, given how recently the Kriegsmarine had begun rebuilding, she was nonetheless a fighting crew in the genuine sense, capable, coordinated, and ready to be tested. What the crew could not entirely escape was the psychological asymmetry of their situation. The Bismarck attracted the attention, the ceremonial visits, the speeches, the photographs that would end up in newspapers and propaganda broadcasts. The Prinz Eugen was present at these moments, but not the subject of them. When Grand Admiral Erich Raeder came aboard to inspect the ships before departure, it was the Bismarck that commanded the ceremony. When Fleet Commander Admiral Günther Lütjens addressed the assembled crews on the eve of the operation's commencement, his words resonated most powerfully with the men of the larger ship. The Prinz Eugen's sailors were professionals. They understood their role, but understanding a role and finding it entirely satisfying are not the same experience, and men who serve well and without complaint in the shroud of something larger are still, quietly, aware of the shadow. There was also a technical asymmetry that mattered in a different way. For all her capabilities, the Prinz Eugen was a heavy cruiser, operating in waters where British capital ships could appear with relatively little warning. Her armor protection, adequate against cruiser-caliber fire, would not save her against the 15-inch shells of a British battleship. This was not a defect, it was the nature of the vessel class. But it meant that her tactical freedom was always constrained by the need to remain close enough to the Bismarck's protection while operating independently enough to fulfill her reconnaissance function. It was a balance that required constant judgment, constant reassessment, and the kind of situational awareness that Brinkmann had been cultivating for years. Every mile he operated away from the Bismarck was a mile where the full consequences of an unexpected contact would fall on him alone. Her electronics suite was, in some respects, the most quietly impressive thing about her. German naval engineers had invested heavily in radar and range-finding technology, and the Prinz Eugen carried systems that were, by the standards of early 1941, genuinely sophisticated. Her hydrophone arrays could detect propeller noise at significant distances. Her rangefinders could acquire and track targets in conditions that would have defeated the optics of an earlier generation. Her fire control computers, electromechanical devices of considerable complexity, could integrate speed, course, range, and environmental factors into gunnery solutions that made her main battery accurate well beyond what raw weapon specifications might suggest. She was, in the language of a later era, a sensor and weapons platform as much as a fighting ship, and in the commerce raiding role, those sensor capabilities might matter as much as her guns. On the night before the German squadron put to sea in earnest, the Prinz Eugen sat at her moorings and absorbed the last preparations. Stores came aboard, ammunition was checked, logged and stowed. Engineering sections ran final tests on machinery that would soon face the sustained demands of high-speed ocean passage. Officers studied charts, compared notes, reviewed the signals and intelligence assessments that described what the British were likely to know and what they were likely to do. The ordinary, unremarkable business of a warship preparing to go to war. The same mundane choreography that has preceded departures in every navy, in every era, in every language the sea has ever been sailed in. Men wrote letters. Men checked equipment they had already checked. Men stood on deck and looked out at the water, which was dark and cold and entirely indifferent to what was about to begin. She was ready, capable, crewed, commanded. Everything the German Navy could have asked of a ship in her class, she was prepared to deliver. And if she could not be the Bismarck, could not carry the weight of myth and expectation that had already begun to accumulate around the great battleship, she could be something arguably more useful, a fast, professional, quietly formidable companion whose value would not be measured in headlines, but in what she enabled and what she survived. Whether that distinction would ultimately serve her crew well, or simply defer the reckoning that Operation Rheinübung had built into itself from the very beginning, was a question that only the Atlantic and the Royal Navy would answer. While German sailors ran their drills in Baltic waters, and Bismarck's vast hull sat low with fuel and ammunition, across the North Sea, men in grey uniform coats bent over charts and decoded signals, watching. The British had not slept through the winter. They had watched the Kriegsmarine's movements with the particular alertness of a nation that understood, in its bones, what it meant to lose control of the sea. Britain was an island. Everything, food, oil, raw steel, American arms, arrived by ship. Every convoy that made port was a quiet victory. Every convoy that went down was a slow bleeding that, sustained long enough, could decide the war without a single soldier setting foot on English soil. The men who understood this most clearly were the ones stationed in the Admiralty's naval intelligence divisions, where reports arrived at all hours, from agents, from aerial photographs, from signals traffic decoded with painstaking care. By the spring of 1941, those reports were beginning to converge on something that demanded serious attention. The first indications were imprecise, as intelligence almost always is. A Swedish vessel, transiting the Kattegat, reported sighting large German warships moving north through Danish waters. Swedish naval officers, who maintained their own careful watch on German naval movements, communicated the sighting through diplomatic back channels. The British naval attaché in Stockholm passed the information along without delay. What arrived in London was fragmentary. Large ships, heavily escorted, heading north. No identification, no confirmation of class or armament. But the timing coincided with signals intelligence suggesting unusual levels of radioactivity from German naval commands, and with aerial reconnaissance that had been tracking unusual preparations at ports along the German and Norwegian coasts. Separately, none of these data points amounted to proof. Together, they pointed towards something that British naval planners had long feared. A major German surface operation was being prepared. It was into this atmosphere of disciplined concern that Admiral John Tovey operated. Tovey commanded the home fleet from his flagship at Scapa Flow, the great natural anchorage in the Orkney Islands that had sheltered British warships through 2 world wars. He was not a man given to dramatizing his circumstances. He was precise, calm, and deeply experienced. A naval officer who understood that in his position, the cost of being wrong was measured not in professional embarrassment, but in ships and lives. He had watched with professional dismay as German surface raiders, the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, had torn through Allied Atlantic convoys during the early months of 1941, sinking or capturing more than 20 merchant vessels in a single operation that the British had been powerless to prevent. That campaign had demonstrated what a well-handled German surface force could accomplish in open water, and it had sharpened Tovey's determination that it would not happen again. He had spent months lobbying for aircraft carriers to be assigned to convoy escort duty. He had pressed for tighter coordination between his fleet and Coastal Command's patrol aircraft. He had done everything a commander could do within the constraints of a navy stretched thin across the world's oceans. When the intelligence reports began arriving in May of 1941, Tovey read them carefully and began to plan. The challenge he faced was geometric as much as tactical. The German ships, if they were in fact preparing for an Atlantic breakout, had several possible routes available to them. They could pass north of Iceland, through the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland, where the ice pack narrowed the passage but did not close it entirely. They could pass south of Iceland, between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, a wider but more exposed route, or they could attempt the Norwegian Sea in conditions of poor visibility, relying on weather to mask their passage. Tovey could not be certain which route Lütjens would choose, and he could not station his entire fleet at every possible exit point. He lacked the ships for that, and the North Atlantic in May was not a place where ships could idle indefinitely. What he could do was establish a patrol screen and pre-position his heavier units to respond quickly once a confirmed sighting arrived. That calculation, how much to commit and where, was the quiet test of a fleet commander's judgment, and Tovey made his choices with the information he had. The cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk were assigned to the Denmark Strait Patrol. These were heavy cruisers, well armed and capable of maintaining contact with a larger force in rough weather, but they were not ships designed to fight a battleship. Their role was not to intercept Bismarck, but to find her and hold her in sight long enough for Tovey's battle fleet to arrive. Both ships were fitted with radar, a technology still new enough to be considered almost miraculous in certain circumstances, and their commanding officers were given clear instructions: if you find the German ships, do not engage, do not lose them, maintain contact, report their course and speed, let the big guns come to you. It was a role that required nerve of a specific kind, the nerve to shadow an enemy far more powerful than yourself, close enough to see, too close for comfort, while waiting for reinforcements that might arrive too late. The main striking force that Tovey prepared to send south was one of the most recognizable pairings in the Royal Navy's order of battle. HMS Hood was the pride of British naval power, a battle cruiser of magnificent proportions, over 260 meters in length, displacing more than 42,000 tons at full load, armed with 8 15-inch guns and carrying a reputation that had been accumulating since her commissioning more than 2 decades before. She had visited ports across the world as a symbol of British naval dominance, and there was barely a sailor in the Royal Navy who had not grown up knowing her silhouette. Alongside her was assigned HMS Prince of Wales, the newest British battleship afloat, so new that she had not yet been fully worked up. Her guns were still being attended to by civilian engineers who would be aboard when the squadron sailed. her crew still learning the rhythms of a ship that had barely been commissioned. The pairing of old pride and new promise seemed, on paper, formidable. In practice, it carried complications that would matter enormously when the moment came. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland was given command of this squadron. He was an experienced officer who understood the respective strengths and weaknesses of his two ships. He knew Hood was fast and powerful, but carried an Achilles heel that British naval architects had acknowledged for years. Her deck armour, by the standards of 1941, was not thick enough to defeat plunging fire at long range. Shells that arrived at a steep angle, dropping from high trajectories across great distances, could penetrate her upper decks in a way that direct fire at shorter ranges could not. This was not a secret. It was a tactical fact built into every plan that involved Hood, a ship that had been scheduled for reconstruction and modernization before the war intervened and made her too valuable to take out of service. Holland knew this. His tactical instinct, when the moment arrived, would be to close the range quickly, to get inside the distance where plunging fire became the dominant risk, and where Hood's broadside would be most effective. That instinct would shape everything. The broader British disposition included other forces. Tovey himself would sail in HMS King George V, with the carrier HMS Victorious and accompanying cruisers and destroyers. Additional forces were positioned or recalled from other duties as the intelligence picture sharpened through the middle of May. Farther south, forces operating from Gibraltar added another layer to the net being drawn across the Atlantic approaches. The geometry of the operation was becoming clearer. If the German ships broke out, they would be entering water surrounded by British forces on multiple bearings, forces that could converge if contact was maintained. The logic was sound. The execution would depend on weather, on luck, and on the Germans making the choices the British expected them to make. What drove the British effort hardest was not merely strategic calculation, but something that functions in naval culture the way instinct does in the individual. Institutional memory. The Scharnhorst raids were fresh. The sinking of merchant ships, each one representing not only cargo, but the lives of merchant sailors who had no armour plate between them and the sea, had left a mark on British naval commanders that did not fade easily. The Admiralty's determination to prevent a repetition was not abstract. It had the weight of recent failure behind it, and the knowledge that the British public, already living on rationed food and enduring German bombing, could not sustain indefinitely the loss of the supply ships that kept the nation alive. Tovey did not need to be reminded of this. He carried it with him as he sailed his fleet into position, as he read each new intelligence report, as he studied charts of the North Sea and tried to imagine where a German admiral thinking clearly would choose to run. By the third week of May 1941, the RAF's Coastal Command had been tasked with flying photographic reconnaissance over Norwegian coastal anchorages. The results, when they came back, removed whatever doubt had remained. The photographs showed Bismarck and Prinz Eugen lying at anchor, their outline unmistakable to trained interpreters who had been studying German naval architecture for years. The ships were there. They were ready. The only question was when they would move, and through which passage they would attempt to reach the open Atlantic. Tovey ordered his forces to sea. The machinery of the largest naval hunt of the war had been set in motion, not with a single decisive command, but through the accumulation of weeks of intelligence work, careful positioning, and the steady professional judgment of men who understood that the sea offers no second chances to the unprepared. The cat-and-mouse game was ending. What replaced it would be something older, louder, and far more final. The water around the Norwegian fjords holds a particular kind of silence, cold, absolute, indifferent to the ambitions of men and machines. In the final days before the breakout, that silence had wrapped itself around two of the most powerful warships afloat. The Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen had waited at anchor, their crews carrying the particular tension of soldiers told to hold still when every instinct screams to move. Shore leave had been cancelled. Mail had stopped flowing. The men who crewed these ships understood, without being told explicitly, that the waiting was almost over. When the orders finally came, precise, clinical, carrying the weight of weeks of planning behind every word, they moved with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had trained for exactly this moment. The anchorage fell behind them, and the open sea opened ahead. The strategic logic behind the breakout was straightforward enough in conception, though far more treacherous in execution. Admiral Günther Lütjens, appointed to command the operation, had studied the available routes with the careful attention of a man who understood that geography itself would be his first adversary. The most direct path into the Atlantic ran through the English Channel, but the Royal Navy's dominance of those waters made that route an invitation to catastrophe. The northern route, curving up past occupied Norway and bending west toward Iceland, offered something the Channel could never provide: distance, darkness, and the brutal, concealing weather of the high North Atlantic. Between Greenland and Iceland lay the Denmark Strait, a corridor of cold water no more than roughly 250 kilometers wide at its navigable points, compressed further by ice fields drifting down from the north. It was narrow, it was dangerous, and it was the only viable door into the Atlantic that Lütjens believed he could force open. The German ships moved north under cover of the kind of overcast skies that the North Atlantic provides almost as a standard offering in late May. Weather had been factored into the planning, not as a bonus but as a prerequisite. Lütjens needed cloud cover the way a man crossing open ground needs shadows. For the first portion of the journey, the clouds cooperated. The ships maintained strict radio silence, their crews standing watch in rotation, the Bismarck's fire control crews keeping their systems warm and ready, even while the ship moved through what appeared to be empty ocean. Speed was regulated carefully, conserving fuel without sacrificing the momentum of the breakout. The fjords of Norway narrowed behind them, replaced by open sea, and then by the vast grey expanse that stretched toward Iceland's southern coast. It was a Swedish naval vessel that provided the first crack in the German plan's secrecy, not through any act of hostility, but simply through the unavoidable fact of being in the same ocean at the same time. The Swedish cruiser HMS Gotland, operating in the Kattegat, observed the German squadron passing northward and reported what she had seen. That report reached Swedish Naval Command, and from there, through the channels that neutral nations sometimes quietly maintain with belligerents who share certain interests, the information made its way to British naval intelligence. The precise timeline of how and when this intelligence moved is one of the quieter stories of the operation, but its consequence was anything but quiet. By the time Lütjens believed his ships were invisible to British awareness, the machinery of British response was already beginning to turn. In London, at the Admiralty, the report from Gotland arrived alongside other fragmentary pieces of intelligence: aerial reconnaissance reports, signals intercepts, the accumulated noise of a navy trying to understand what another navy was doing in real time. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the home fleet from his flagship at Scapa Flow, had been watching the Baltic situation with the focused attention of a chess player who suspects his opponent is about to make an aggressive move. When the intelligence solidified, when the various threads of information wove themselves into something approaching confirmation that Bismarck was not merely exercising, but breaking out, Tovey's response was swift. He began repositioning his forces. He ordered the heavy cruisers HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk to patrol the Denmark Strait. He brought his battleships to readiness. The home fleet, that great and dispersed instrument of British sea power, began drawing itself toward a point where it might intercept the threat. Above the North Sea and the waters approaching Iceland, British reconnaissance aircraft pushed into deteriorating weather, their crews squinting through cockpit glass at a grey world that offered few certainties. The search for the German squadron was not a single dramatic discovery, but a patient, grinding process of elimination, sector by sector, contact by contact. Then came the sighting that changed everything. A Royal Air Force aircraft, flying through heavy cloud and difficult visibility, spotted the German ships. The contact report that flashed back to British Naval Command contained the essential information: the Bismarck and a companion vessel, their course pointing unmistakably toward the Denmark Strait. The race, which had been a matter of preparation and positioning for days, became immediate. Both sides now knew that the other knew. For the crews of Suffolk and Norfolk, already holding their positions in the bitterly cold waters of the Denmark Strait, the intelligence was confirmation of what they had been positioned to find. These were not battleships. They were heavy cruisers, powerful enough in their own right, but not designed to stand and fight against the Bismarck's 15-inch guns. Their role was not to engage but to shadow, to maintain contact, to feed the stream of position reports back to Tovey's approaching force. They moved along the edges of the ice pack, using radar, a technology still new enough in 1941 to carry the quality of an advantage not yet fully understood by either side, to reach through the mist and fog that the strait provided in abundance. When Suffolk's radar finally picked up the distinctive returns of large warships moving at speed, the operators aboard her knew precisely what they were looking at. The Bismarck emerged from the fog as a silhouette first, then a shape, then a presence. The Suffolk maintained her distance with the careful instinct of a smaller animal that has spotted something much larger, respectful, watchful, never closing to within the range where the German guns could settle the question definitively. Norfolk came closer than she should have during the initial contact, close enough that the Bismarck's forward turrets swung and fired, the first shots of Operation Rheinübung, not against a convoy, not against a defended target, but against the cruiser that had stumbled through the mist and found herself briefly inside effective gun range. Norfolk pulled away into the fog, shaken but undamaged. The Germans had announced themselves, and the announcement had cost them the element of surprise they had spent so much effort preserving. Every naval force within range now knew exactly where the Bismarck was. Lutyens understood what contact with Suffolk and Norfolk meant. Those cruisers were not threats in themselves. They were eyes, British eyes, sending continuous position reports northward to where Tovey's heavy ships were steaming south at maximum speed, and southward to where other forces were being redirected to seal the exits. The Denmark Strait, which had looked on the planning charts like a corridor of possibility, was becoming a corridor with walls that were slowly closing. The ice pack pressed from the north, the British cruisers shadowed from the south and east. The speed advantage that the Bismarck enjoyed in theory was being eroded by the simple fact of continuous contact. There was nowhere to run that the British didn't already know about. Lutyens pushed his ships forward anyway, holding course for the Atlantic, gambling that speed and darkness and the sheer scale of the ocean ahead would eventually break the contact. The 24th of May moved toward its darkest hours, which in those latitudes at that time of year are never entirely dark, the sky shifting instead into a pale, perpetual twilight that gives no real cover. The Bismarck drove through heavy seas at more than 28 knots, her bow throwing spray, her crew at battle stations. The tension aboard her neither panic nor calm, but something in between. The focused alertness of men who know they are being watched, and who are watching in return. Prinz Eugen, somewhat ahead of the flagship on Lütjen's order, held formation with the practiced discipline of her crew. The two ships moved as a unit, their positions known to the British, their destination known to themselves. The ocean between them and France measuring itself in days rather than hours. What neither side fully grasped in those hours of shadowing and counter-shadowing was how quickly the situation was about to crystallize. Tovey's main force was still hours away, too far to intercept before morning. But converging from the south, from Scapa Flow, steaming hard through the same heavy northern seas, came a force that was not waiting for the main battle fleet to arrive. HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales, already at sea when the contact reports began coming in, were now on a course that would bring them across Bismarck's path in the hours just before dawn. They were racing toward the same point that the German ships were racing through. The Denmark Strait, cold and grey and indifferent as it had always been, was about to become something that neither the charts nor the planning documents had ever fully prepared for. The breakout had worked. The Bismarck and Prinz Eugen had reached the Atlantic approaches. The Denmark Strait lay behind them, or almost behind them, almost, but not quite, because steaming toward them through the pale northern morning were two ships whose crews had been told, in one form or another, what was at stake. The pride of the Royal Navy and the newest British battleship, converging on a point of ocean that history was already, invisibly, marking as significant. The German gamble had achieved its first objective, the open water. But the water was not as open as Lütjens had hoped. And what came next would decide, within the span of a few terrible minutes, whether the boldest German naval operation of the war would succeed or collapse before it had truly begun. The Denmark Strait, on the morning of the 24th of May, 1941, is not a place that offers comfort. Stretching between the frozen coast of Greenland to the west and the volcanic shores of Iceland to the east, it is a corridor roughly 300 kilometers wide, choked with drifting pack ice, half swallowed by fog, and swept by seas that make even experienced sailors grip the nearest handhold. Visibility shifts without warning. One moment the horizon is clear, the next, the world closes to a grey wall of mist and spindrift. The temperature is barely above freezing. Swells roll in from the deep Atlantic, heavy and rhythmic, lifting warships as though they weigh nothing. It is in this inhospitable channel, under a sky that cannot decide between darkness and dawn, that two of the Royal Navy's most powerful ships are steaming northeast, hunting. And somewhere ahead of them, moving fast through the same grey water, Bismarck and Prinz Eugen are pushing south. The British intercept had not happened by chance. The cruisers HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk had been patrolling the strait for days, positioned precisely because Admiral John Tovey understood that the Denmark Strait represented the most likely breakout route. When Suffolk's radar locked onto the German ships the previous evening, she had maintained contact through the night, transmitting position reports at irregular intervals to avoid giving Bismarck's gunnery crews a consistent radio fix to shoot at. Through the early hours of the morning, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding from Hood, had been steering to cut off the German squadron. His ships were driving hard, vibrating with the exertion of full speed, pushing past 27 knots into heavy seas that sent spray crashing across their forward turrets. The geometry of the intercept was closing fast. By approximately 5:45 in the morning, Hood and Prince of Wales could already see faint shapes on the horizon ahead, the silhouettes growing, hardening, becoming ships. Vice Admiral Holland's approach angle carried a serious tactical flaw, and it would cost everything. He was steering almost directly toward the German ships, which meant only his forward turrets could bear on the target. Hood's rear turrets, the paired 15-inch guns that made her so formidable on paper, were effectively masked by her own superstructure. Hood was built for a different era. Her armor protection, particularly her horizontal deck armor, reflected the design assumptions of 1916, not 1941. She was magnificent in appearance, nearly 260 meters long, displacing more than 42,000 tons when loaded, with a silhouette so graceful that she had spent years as the Royal Navy's most famous ambassador, sailing to ports across the world. To the men who served in the fleet, she was not merely a warship, she was a symbol. She was the pride the Navy wore in public, and now she was closing on Bismarck at a combined approach speed that left almost no time for doubt or adjustment. Both sides opened fire within seconds of each other. Hood's forward guns fired first, their muzzle flashes erupting orange and white in the grey morning light, the concussive wave rolling back across the ship. Prince of Wales followed almost simultaneously. Across the water, Bismarck's forward turrets answered. Those massive twin mountings, housing 8 15-inch guns capable of hurling shells that each weighed over 800 kilograms, began their methodical, devastating work. Prinz Eugen had actually opened fire slightly before Bismarck, her 8-inch shells already reaching out toward the British ships. The distances involved were staggering. The opening ranges exceeded 24 kilometers, meaning shells spent more than 30 seconds in the air between firing and impact. Men on both sides stood in their action stations, watching the distant flashes, counting seconds, bracing for what might arrive. The German gunnery was precise from the very first salvos. Prinz Eugen's shells found Hood almost immediately, striking near her boat deck and igniting ready-use ammunition and fuel stored there. A fire broke out aft on Hood's superstructure, visible, alarming, but not yet fatal. At those distances, under the harsh conditions of the strait, achieving accurate fire so quickly spoke to the quality of German range-finding and fire control. Bismarck's gunnery director, working with optical rangefinders and a sophisticated centralized fire control system, was already straddling the British ships. Straddling is the term naval gunners use when their shells land on both sides of the target. It means the next salvo corrects for the split, and the salvo after that hits. The British sailors watching the shell splashes rise from the freezing water on either side of their ships understood what straddling meant. The men below decks, sealed into machinery spaces and magazines and shell-handling rooms, could not see anything at all. Holland ordered a course change to open his arcs, to bring Hood's rear turrets into action. It was the right decision. Whether it came too late, or whether events had already overtaken any possible correction, will never be answered with certainty. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, Bismarck's fifth salvo reached Hood. The shells arrived in tight formation, the product of accurate ranging, and at least one of them struck the ship somewhere near her after magazines. What happened next took less than 3 minutes and claimed more than 1,300 lives. A vast column of fire erupted from Hood amidships, initially orange at its base and white at its core, towering hundreds of meters into the grey sky. The explosion was not a single event but a catastrophic chain. Fire reaching the cordite charges and shells stored in the after magazines, detonating with an energy that no warship structure, whatever its design, could contain. Hood broke apart. Witnesses on Prince of Wales and on the German ships watched in stunned disbelief. Men who had expected a long gunnery battle, a grinding exchange that might last an hour, saw instead a ship of over 40,000 tons simply cease to exist as a coherent structure within minutes. Her bow rose from the water as her stern vanished, the forward section tilting almost vertically before sliding beneath the surface. Debris rained across a wide area, sections of plating, equipment, unrecognizable fragments of what had been the most famous warship in the world. The sea where she had been was covered with oil and wreckage, and the very few survivors who had been thrown clear by the initial explosion. 3 men survived. 3 out of a crew of more than 1,400. The mathematics are almost too stark to hold in the mind. On Prince of Wales, the shock was immediate and total. She was now alone against 2 German warships, neither of which had suffered any significant damage at that point. Her captain, John Leach, pressed on, not because the odds had improved, but because the alternative was to turn away before the fight had truly begun, with Hood's wreckage still visible astern. Prince of Wales was herself not a fully worked-up ship. She had been commissioned only recently, and civilian dockyard workers from her builders had still been aboard finishing unresolved mechanical issues when she sailed. Her forward guns had been experiencing mechanical problems even as the engagement opened. She fought on regardless, her gun crews working through jams, her gunnery teams doing what trained men do when the situation demands the impossible, continuing. But Bismarck and Prinz Eugen now turned their combined fire on Prince of Wales, and the consequences arrived quickly. Shells struck her repeatedly, hitting her compass platform and causing casualties among her bridge crew, penetrating her hull below the waterline, damaging internal compartments. Water was flooding into sections of the ship. Her gunnery director was put out of action. The flagship had gone. The second ship was being beaten apart. Captain Leach made the decision to disengage, laying down a smoke screen and turning away to the south. It was not cowardice. It was the recognition that staying would accomplish nothing beyond the loss of a second capital ship. The German ships did not pursue. They had other concerns, and they held, for that grey morning, the absolute advantage. In the operations rooms and flag offices of the British Admiralty in London, the signals arrived in quick succession and made no sense at first. Hood is gone. Hood had been expected to win, expected to intercept and overwhelm. She was the standard against which British naval power measured itself. Officers who had served in her, men who had seen her in ports from Gibraltar to Singapore, received the news with a disbelief that briefly overwhelmed professional composure. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound, faced a room where certainty had just been stripped away. The calculation shifted immediately and entirely. Bismarck was not simply a threat to Atlantic convoys anymore. She was something that had just destroyed the centerpiece of British naval prestige in less than 3 minutes of accurate German gunnery. She had to be found. She had to be sunk. Not for strategy alone now, for something older and more visceral than strategy, for Hood, for the 1,300 men who had gone down with her into the freezing water of the Denmark Strait without ever seeing what killed them. The psychological weight of those 3 minutes would shape every decision the Royal Navy made for the next 72 hours. Signals went out from the Admiralty with an urgency that was almost physical. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all redirected, all given a single overriding purpose. The Atlantic, vast as it was, had somehow shrunk to a single chase. Bismarck had struck the hardest blow the Kriegsmarine would land on the Royal Navy in the entire war. She had done it in less time than it takes to eat a meal. And now she was somewhere to the south, trailing oil from damage Prince of Wales had managed to inflict before withdrawing, heading for the open ocean. The hunt that would define the naval war in the Atlantic was no longer a matter of strategy. It was personal, and it had only just begun. The smoke from the Denmark Strait engagement had barely cleared when the reality of naval combat asserted itself with brutal clarity. HMS Prince of Wales, commissioned less than 3 months before this moment, faced an enemy that had already demonstrated devastating accuracy. The battleship that represented the very newest in British naval technology found herself fighting not one opponent, but two. The Bismarck bearing down with 8 15-inch guns, and the Prinz Eugen adding her own 8-inch armament to the storm of steel. For the Prince of Wales, this was not a battle of equals, but a trial by fire that would test both her design and the courage of her crew in ways that no peacetime exercise could simulate. The ship's gunnery systems, still not fully proven in combat, would determine whether she survived this morning or joined the hood on the ocean floor. Her captain, John Leach, stood in the fire control tower with the knowledge that his decisions in the next few minutes would shape the fates of his 1,600 men. The opening salvos had found their mark with terrifying speed. Bismarck's gunnery officers, trained in the methodical German tradition of fire control, had calculated ranges with precision and adjusted with mathematical efficiency. The first hits on the Prince of Wales came not in isolation, but in a sequence that seemed to strip away the battleship's invulnerability layer by layer. A shell crashed through the bridge structure, killing or wounding several officers and damaging communication systems that were critical to coordinating the ship's defense. Another round penetrated deeper into the hull, though it did not immediately explode, leaving a trail of destruction that the crew would discover only in the aftermath of battle. The Prince of Wales began to absorb damage that extended far beyond simple surface wounds. Her superstructure, that collection of masts, rangefinders, and fire control equipment that allowed her to locate and engage the enemy, was being systematically dismantled by accurate German fire. The gunnery director, the sophisticated optical and mechanical system that allowed the ship to maintain accuracy at extreme range, took a catastrophic hit. This was not a minor malfunction that could be worked around. It was a crippling blow to the battleship's ability to fight effectively. The men who operated this system, positioned high in the ship where they could observe fall of shot and send corrections to the gun crews, were suddenly blind. The Prince of Wales guns could still fire, but directing their shots across more than 20 kilometers of sea without the precision instruments that had been designed for this exact purpose meant reverting to manual methods that were far less accurate. Captain Leach and his gunnery officer understood immediately that they were fighting at a severe disadvantage. The technical superiority that the Prince of Wales was supposed to bring to this engagement was being stripped away, piece by piece, by the superior marksmanship and fire discipline of their opponents. Yet the British battleship was not simply absorbing punishment without effect. Her own gunnery crews, despite the damage and confusion that was accumulating around them, managed to deliver fire that found the German battleship. The Prince of Wales' 14-inch guns, though smaller than the Bismarck's main armament, were handled by men who understood their weapon and who refused to surrender the fight despite the odds. Several shells struck home on the German flagship, and among these hits was one that would prove far more significant than it appeared in the immediate chaos of battle. A projectile penetrated the Bismarck's forward fuel bunkers, rupturing the sealed compartments that held precious oil fuel for the German engines. This was not a hit that would sink the Bismarck or even slow her immediately, but it was a wound that would fester and compound, a problem that would grow worse as the ship continued at high speed through rough Atlantic waters. The German officers on Bismarck's bridge felt the impact and understood that something fundamental had changed in their tactical situation. The damage to the Prince of Wales' steering systems manifested as a problem that Captain Leach realized was becoming progressively worse. The ship's rudder was not destroyed, but the hydraulic lines that controlled it had taken damage that made the steering mechanism increasingly sluggish and unreliable. This was a problem of a different order than damaged superstructure or destroyed gunnery equipment. A battleship that could not steer with precision was a battleship that could not maneuver effectively to avoid incoming fire. Captain Leach was faced with a deteriorating situation where his ability to fight was declining, his ability to evade was becoming compromised, and the bombardment from 2 German ships showed no signs of diminishing in intensity. The smoke that was now rising from multiple fires aboard the Prince of Wales began to obscure her own gun crew's view of the target, adding another layer of difficulty to an already desperate situation. The crew, many of them young men on their first deployment in a new ship, were being tested in a way that no amount of training could truly prepare them for. The psychological dimension of this engagement cannot be separated from its tactical reality. The men aboard the Prince of Wales had entered this battle believing that they were fighting to avenge the Hood, to restore honor to the Royal Navy, and to stop a German warship that represented everything their nation was fighting against. Within minutes, they found themselves fighting for survival, fighting to keep their ship afloat and their comrades from being killed by the shell bursts that were now occurring with sickening regularity. The compartments deep within the ship, where sailors worked in conditions of heat and confined darkness, felt each impact through the hull plates around them. The men operating the damage control parties were racing through narrow corridors, responding to reports of fires, flooding, and wounded men who needed to be evacuated to the medical bays. The crew adapted with the professionalism that would characterize British naval personnel throughout the war, but adaptation and professionalism could not change the fundamental fact that they were facing an enemy they could not effectively engage at full strength. The ammunition being expended in this engagement was extraordinary in quantity and devastating in effect. Each salvo from the German ships sent multiple projectiles, each weighing many tons, across the narrowing gap between the combatants. The Prince of Wales returned fire with equal determination, her guns continuing to serve out shells from the magazines deep below, in spaces where the gun crews could hear the impacts and feel the concussions, but could only imagine the destruction occurring above them. The rate of fire that both sides were maintaining meant that the engagement, though it would last only minutes in duration, would consume ammunition at a rate that left both fleets' supply officers calculating fuel consumption and reload times. The Prince of Wales was spending her capacity for destruction with each salvo, depleting the magazines that could not be instantly replenished. British naval doctrine had trained her officers to think in terms of sustained engagements, of the long tactical battle where positioning and endurance determined outcome. Instead, they found themselves in something closer to a knife fight, where the initial exchange of blows determined survival. Captain Leach made the decision that was both tactically sound and profoundly difficult. To remain in the engagement was to risk having his battleship sunk alongside the Hood, adding another capital ship to the list of British naval losses. The Prince of Wales had inflicted damage on Bismarck, damage that was real and would matter, but she could not win this engagement against 2 opponents when her own fire control systems were compromised and her damage was accumulating faster than it could be repaired. The decision to withdraw was not a retreat in the sense of flight or abandonment of the battle. It was a recognition of tactical reality and the preservation of a warship that would be needed in future battles. The order was given, and the Prince of Wales began to move away from the engagement, her guns continuing to fire as she increased distance from her opponents. The smoke, the noise, the chaos of battle gradually began to diminish as the range extended and the immediate threat of being overwhelmed by German gunnery receded. The withdrawal was not clean or swift. The Prince of Wales' damaged steering meant that she could not maneuver with the precision that would have allowed her to present the smallest possible target to the enemy guns still firing in her direction. She was vulnerable during this phase of the engagement, and German gunners recognized the opportunity and pressed their advantage. Additional hits rained down on the retreating battleship, adding to her damage and pushing her further away from the zone of the fiercest combat. Yet each hit that struck the Prince of Wales while she was withdrawing was a hit that the enemy was not directing at the hood, which was still locked in the central engagement with the Bismarck. The Prince of Wales was absorbing punishment that might otherwise have fallen on her flagship, and in that sense, the damage she suffered became a form of sacrifice, however inadvertent. The crew understood this, and their determination to keep the ship moving, to keep her guns serving ammunition, remained steady despite the horror unfolding around them. The moment when the Prince of Wales withdrew from close engagement marks a turning point in the battle that has often been overlooked in favor of the more dramatic fate of the hood. From the perspective of the German commanders, particularly Admiral Lütjens and Captain Lindemann, the withdrawal of the Prince of Wales appeared to confirm the tactical victory they had already won with the destruction of the hood. Yet from the perspective of the British Admiralty and the officers commanding the home fleet, the news that the Prince of Wales had survived and had inflicted damage on Bismarck carried a weight that was not immediately apparent. The German battleship had been bloodied by the newest British battleship, marking her as a ship that could be hurt, that was not, despite her impressive armament and armor, an invulnerable weapon that would dominate the Atlantic by virtue of her technical superiority alone. This realization would shape the calculations that Admiral Tovey and his staff would make in the hours and days that followed. The damage that the Prince of Wales had inflicted on the Bismarck, though not immediately catastrophic, began a chain of consequences that neither the German commanders nor the British observers fully understood in that moment. The ruptured fuel bunkers were leaking oil into the sea, leaving a trail that would eventually be detected and tracked. The German battleship's maximum speed had been reduced, a decline that would matter enormously as the chase for survival began. The Prinz Eugen had escaped the engagement almost untouched, sliding around the periphery of the battle and avoiding the most intense fire. The Prince of Wales had been mauled, her gunnery systems compromised, her hull penetrated in multiple places, her crew shaken by the ferocity of the engagement and the loss of the hood. Yet she remained afloat, her engines still functioning, her core structure intact. The battle in the Denmark Strait had not produced a clear outcome in the way that tactical engagements were supposed to produce victors and vanquished, but rather had set conditions for a longer chase that would unfold over the next days. The aftermath of the Prince of Wales' withdrawal was consumed with damage assessment and the calculation of whether the ship could continue operations or whether she needed to limp back to port for repairs. The gunnery director was destroyed beyond immediate field repair, the steering system was unreliable, and the damage to the hull required detailed inspection to determine its full extent. The medical teams were overwhelmed with casualties, some wounded, some dying, some lost entirely in compartments that were sealed off to contain flooding or fire. The engine room crews, working in heat that was becoming increasingly intense as fires raged in other parts of the ship, maintained propulsion and kept the Prince of Wales moving forward. By any measure, the ship had suffered a severe mauling, had been forced to withdraw from engagement and had lost a sister ship in the same battle. Yet the fact that the Prince of Wales survived at all, that her crew had kept fighting despite overwhelming circumstances, and that she had managed to damage the German battleship before disengaging, meant that the tactical situation, though appearing as a German victory in its immediate context, carried within it the seeds of a very different outcome in the hours that would follow. The morning after the Denmark Strait erupted into gunfire, Bismarck's crew discovered a truth that shattered their confidence. The ship that had seemed invulnerable to her designers, that had inspired such certainty in her captain and admiral, was bleeding, not spectacularly, not with the sudden catastrophe that had consumed Hood, but steadily, relentlessly, from wounds inflicted by HMS Prince of Wales in those crucial minutes of exchange. The damage control parties worked through compartments lit only by emergency lighting, wading through seawater already ankle-deep in some sections, their flashlights cutting through darkness and smoke as they struggled to assess the magnitude of what had happened. What they found was troubling. Multiple armor-piercing shells from the British battleship had struck Bismarck's hull at various points, but the most critical damage lay forward, where the concussive force of near misses and at least one direct hit had ruptured fuel oil tanks. Bismarck carried enormous quantities of fuel. She needed to, for the transatlantic voyage ahead, and that fuel was now escaping into the North Sea through ruptures in her hull that could not be sealed. The rate of loss was not catastrophic, but it was measurable. It was permanent. It could not be repaired at sea. Admiral Gunther Lütjens stood on the bridge wing as dawn broke over the grey waters of the Denmark Strait, studying the damage reports as they arrived from below. He was a man accustomed to bearing the weight of command, but this burden pressed harder than anticipated. Operation Rheinübung had begun with the destruction of the pride of the Royal Navy. That alone should have been sufficient cause for jubilation, for confirmation that German naval superiority was real and not merely theoretical. Yet Lütjens possessed too much experience, had commanded at sea too often, to mistake tactical success for operational freedom. The loss of fuel oil meant that Bismarck's maximum range was now contracted. The ships that had entered the Denmark Strait as instruments of unlimited ocean commerce raiding were now constrained, bounded by the mathematics of consumption and distance. A battleship of over 41,000 tons, traveling at high speed through heavy seas, consumes fuel at a rate proportional to her desperation. Lütjens faced a calculation that would determine the fate of his entire operation. How far could Bismarck now travel, and where could she go that offered either sanctuary or repair? Captain Ernst Lindemann, commanding Bismarck herself, received the damage estimates with visible frustration. He was a warrior, not a logistician, yet warfare had suddenly become a problem of logistics. The forward fuel tanks could no longer be trusted to maintain their loads. The flooding, though controlled, continued in slow measure. The gunnery director had sustained damage that would require specialist repairs beyond anything that could be accomplished aboard. Bismarck's maximum sustained speed, once a reliable 31 knots, was now constrained. The ship could achieve higher speeds in brief bursts, but maintaining such velocity would accelerate fuel consumption and risk opening the ruptures further, potentially flooding more critical compartments. Lindemann understood what these numbers meant in operational terms. They meant that Bismarck could not simply race into the Atlantic, vanish among the vast emptiness of open ocean, and hunt merchant convoys at leisure. She could not operate independently for months. She was wounded, and wounds imposed time constraints. Lindemann called for the senior engineering officers and began working through the possibilities. Could the fuel pumps be realigned to feed from undamaged tanks, while the ruptured ones were sealed? Could repairs to the gunnery director be accomplished with shipboard facilities? What was the absolute minimum speed necessary to maintain sufficient maneuverability, and what range would that afford them? The dialogue between Lütjens and Lindemann, carried out through formal channels of naval hierarchy, yet suffused with the urgency of men who understood the stakes, centered on a single strategic question: should Bismarck turn back toward Norway, where German-held ports and shipyard facilities existed, or should she push forward towards Saint-Nazaire in occupied France? The mathematics favored neither option cleanly. A return to Norwegian waters meant abandoning Operation Rheinübung entirely, crawling back to base with the battleship damaged but salvageable, admitting that the grand strategic gamble had ended before it truly began. The British, moreover, would not permit such a retreat without harassment. With HMS Prince of Wales and other British naval forces in pursuit, any northbound course would lead to repeated engagements over a period of days as Bismarck fought her way back toward defended waters. Those engagements would consume ammunition, risk further damage, and probably end with the crippled battleship trapped in Norwegian fjords by the converging Royal Navy. It was a scenario neither officer found acceptable. The alternative was both more ambitious and more perilous. Saint-Nazaire lay approximately 3,000 kilometers to the south and slightly east, situated on the French coast near the mouth of the Loire River. The Kriegsmarine maintained an enormous dry dock there, a facility built to repair ships precisely of Bismarck's size. If Bismarck could reach Saint-Nazaire, she could be hauled into that dry dock, her fuel tanks repaired, her gunnery director restored, her minor wounds healed. In perhaps 2 or 3 weeks, she would emerge fully restored to operational capability and could then proceed with the original plan of commerce raiding in the Atlantic. Such a recovery seemed theoretically possible, the route from the Denmark Strait to Saint-Nazaire, while long, followed courses already charted by German naval planners. The Royal Navy, stretched across the North Atlantic, and the approaches to the British Isles, could not maintain an impenetrable blockade over every possible vector. If Bismarck moved quickly enough, if she chose her course wisely, if the weather turned favorable, she might break through to France. Yet this path also carried its own heavy risks. The British, now fully alerted to the German threat and burning with the need to avenge Hood, would spare no effort to locate and intercept the German battleship. Every hour that Bismarck remained at sea was an hour during which British forces could position themselves, search aircraft could scour the waters, and radio intercepts could provide clues to her location. The further south she sailed, the closer she approached areas where the British had deployed aircraft and naval assets to protect convoy routes. Lütjens made his decision, and it was characteristically aggressive. He would drive for France. He ordered Bismarck and Prinz Eugen to set course for Saint-Nazaire, maintaining the highest speed compatible with fuel conservation and structural integrity. The damaged battleship would not retreat. She would press forward into the teeth of British opposition, her damaged fuel tanks and compromised engineering systems no deterrent to a commander determined to complete his mission or die attempting it. It was a decision that reflected both the audacity that had made the operation conceivable in the first place and a certain inflexibility of thinking. Lütjens was operating under standing orders from Berlin to conduct commerce raiding in the Atlantic. If those orders could not be fulfilled, then at least the operation would conclude in a manner that satisfied honor and demonstrated German naval courage. Retreat was unacceptable. The course for Saint-Nazaire was set. What neither Lütjens nor Lindemann fully grasped was how completely the operational picture had shifted. Bismarck was no longer the hunter. She was hunted, and hunted by an enemy galvanized by rage and loss. The destruction of HMS Hood had shocked the British Admiralty and the British people. Hood had been not merely a warship, but a symbol, the embodiment of Royal Navy supremacy, a ship that had served with distinction for 2 decades and whose sinking seemed to violate the natural order of naval conflict. The response from London was immediate and comprehensive. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the Home Fleet, received orders that left no room for ambiguity. Bismarck must be found and destroyed before she escaped into the Atlantic. All available resources were to be mobilized. Every ship, every aircraft, every radio operator straining to intercept signals, every tactical decision would be directed toward that singular objective. The Royal Navy began executing the greatest coordinated search and pursuit operation of its entire wartime record. It was not yet a manhunt. Bismarck was still traveling at considerable speed with her powerful armament intact, but it possessed the character of one, a great wounded animal moving across the landscape toward distant safety, while its pursuers gathered from all directions, closing in, determined not to let it escape. Bismarck's crew, meanwhile, possessed only fragmentary awareness of the full extent of the forces arrayed against them. They knew that HMS Prince of Wales had been damaged and had broken off the engagement. They knew that Bismarck had landed the killing blow against Hood. They knew that the ship beneath them remained the most heavily armoured, most powerfully armed battleship in the world. Yet in the compartments where damage control parties worked, where the engineering spaces rang with the sound of men attempting to halt the flow of seawater, where officers reviewed the damage reports and calculated remaining fuel reserves, a different picture emerged. The confidence that had characterized the crew during the transit through the Baltic gave way to uncertainty. The ship was damaged, the operation was being diverted. The original plan of venturing deep into the Atlantic and hunting merchant convoys for weeks or months was already compromised. The journey to Saint-Nazaire, which had seemed a comfortable transit when conceived during planning stages in Hamburg, now appeared an ordeal. Bismarck had become what she was never supposed to be, a damaged ship running toward shelter, rather than a predator ranging free across open ocean. The radio operators aboard Bismarck maintained contact with German naval command ashore, and those transmissions themselves became a source of danger. The British were intercepting these signals, not always decrypting them immediately, but knowing from direction finding that they originated from Bismarck and using multiple intercepts to triangulate her approximate position. Every transmission was a beacon. The more Lütjens communicated with Berlin and with other German naval assets, the more he assisted the British in maintaining a general awareness of his location. This was the trap of modern naval warfare, not yet fully understood by all the navies practicing it. Wireless telegraphy, essential for coordinating operations across vast distances, was also a vulnerability that could be exploited by a patient and resourceful enemy. The Royal Navy, through its intercept services and its direction-finding stations scattered across the British Isles and in distant possessions, was weaving a net not yet visible to the German command, but becoming denser by the hour. As darkness fell on that first day after the Denmark Strait engagement, Bismarck pressed southward, her starboard side marked with the scars of gunfire, her forward compartments partially flooded yet under control, her speed reduced but still considerable. Prinz Eugen maintained station beside her, the heavy cruiser seemingly unscathed, her captain alert for any indication that Bismarck's condition was deteriorating further. The two ships had entered a new phase of their operation, though few aboard recognized it as such. They were no longer advancing toward opportunity. They were racing against time, against distance, against the gathering response of an enemy that had accepted the loss of Hood and channeled that loss into implacable determination. In the British Admiralty, in the plotting rooms where officers moved markers representing German and British ships across large charts of the North Atlantic, the picture was still incomplete, but the pattern was becoming clear. A damaged German battleship was heading south. Every ship, every aircraft, every resource that the Royal Navy could muster was being positioned to intercept her before she reached the safety of a French port. The character of Operation Rheinübung had transformed utterly in the space of a few hours. What was intended as a bold offensive thrust into the Atlantic had become a desperate dash for shelter. The battleship that was supposed to reign supreme in the northern waters and strike merchant convoys at will was instead nursing her wounds and absorbing the undivided attention of the second largest naval power in the world. 3,000 kilometers to Saint-Nazaire suddenly seemed like an immense distance, a gap that would need to be closed while pursued by an enemy burning with determination. Bismarck was still dangerous. Her main armament was intact. Her armor was proof against many threats, and her crew remained disciplined and skilled. But danger was no longer synonymous with security. Wounded animals, even dangerous ones, were vulnerable, and in the waters of the North Atlantic in late May of 1941, with the British fleet mobilizing in response to the loss of their most famous battleship, vulnerability was a condition that might not be survived. The British Admiralty received the news of Hood's destruction as a body receives a mortal wound, shock, followed by a desperate, focused rage. In the war rooms of the Admiralty in London, where officers had trained since peacetime to expect naval superiority, the loss of the battlecruiser transformed strategic calculation into something more primal, a hunt. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the home fleet from his flagship HMS King George V, understood with absolute clarity what was now required. Bismarck had to be found, pursued relentlessly, and destroyed before she could reach the safety of a French port, where repair facilities, coastal defences, and the Luftwaffe would shield her from further assault. The alternative, a damaged but operational German battleship loose in the Atlantic for months to come, was strategically unacceptable and politically unbearable. Tovey began issuing orders with the methodical precision of a man who knew that only overwhelming force coordinated across hundreds of kilometers of ocean could achieve his objective. Every available ship, every aircraft, every scrap of intelligence capacity was mobilized toward one end, the hunting down and destruction of the German battle fleet. The immediate challenge was one of distance and uncertainty. Bismarck and Prinz Eugen had been moving southeast from the Denmark Strait, but the exact position of the German ships was known only in fragments. Radio reports came in from aircraft, from merchant vessels, from shadowing cruisers, yet the tactical picture remained frustratingly incomplete. The British knew that Bismarck was damaged, that much was confirmed by multiple sources, but how severely remained unclear. Some reports suggested fuel oil streaming from her hull. Others mentioned possible steering damage. The question that dominated the Admiralty's calculations was which direction the German admiral would choose. Would Lütjen's attempt to break back into the Atlantic, seeking distance and the vast emptiness of open ocean? Would he make for Norway, seeking the protection of German-held fjords? Or, most likely, would he accept the shorter route and race for the occupied French ports on the Bay of Biscay, where repair facilities awaited and where air support could be provided? Tovey suspected the latter, and his deployment of forces reflected that judgment. Yet suspicion was not certainty, and the margin for error was measured in lives and in the fate of empire. The aircraft carrier HMS Victorious had been detached to hunt Bismarck alongside the cruisers shadowing the German ship. The weather was deteriorating as the day progressed. A heavy Atlantic swell was running, cloud bases were dropping, and visibility was becoming unreliable. Yet Tovey ordered Victorious to launch an attack regardless of conditions. 9 Swordfish torpedo bombers, biplane aircraft that looked antiquated even in 1941, were launched into the grey afternoon. These machines, slow and vulnerable, would have to fly toward a battleship equipped with modern anti-aircraft defenses and search for her in worsening weather. The odds seemed desperately thin, yet the order reflected the desperation of the moment. For the British pilots, many of them relatively inexperienced, the mission had the character of a last desperate throw. They climbed into their cockpits, checked their instruments, and turned toward the northeast, searching for the vast silhouette of the German battleship. The formation moved through cloud banks and rain squalls, their engines droning against the wind, each man aware that if they found their target, the flak and machine gun fire would be formidable and unforgiving. The Swordfish aircraft discovered Bismarck after nearly 90 minutes of searching through poor visibility. The German battleship was visible through breaks in the clouds, moving through heavy seas with her superstructure scorched and her hull bearing the marks of her battle with Prince of Wales. The British pilots aligned for their attack runs, descending through the murk toward a ship that was preparing her anti-aircraft defenses. The Germans had detected the aircraft on their radar, and every gun crew that could be brought to bear was manned and ready. The torpedo bombers came in low, their fixed landing gear extended, their frames vibrating with engine noise and strain. Anti-aircraft guns from Bismarck and her escort opened fire, tracers climbing into the grey sky, shells bursting in airburst patterns designed to saturate an area with lethal fragments. The British pilots flew through this curtain of fire with courage born of necessity rather than calculated bravery. Their torpedoes were released at point-blank range, and the aircraft banked away, climbing back into cloud cover, counting the seconds between release and possible detonation. Below them, Bismarck's gun crews tracked the withdrawing aircraft, firing at shadows and sound rather than clearly defined targets. The torpedoes that had been so carefully aimed and released did not find their mark. The German battleship, despite her damage and her sluggish handling, managed to evade the main attack. Her crew felt the shock waves of explosions in the water nearby, felt the concussive force and the heat, but the lethal strikes that might have crippled her further did not materialize. The Swordfish aircraft, nursing their damaged machines and low fuel reserves, turned back toward Victorious to land and rearm. For the British sailors and pilots involved in the attack, there was disappointment but not despair. They had pressed the attack home against overwhelming defensive fire, and the very attempt had accomplished something psychologically important. Bismarck was no longer a distant abstraction, but a confirmed target that could be found and engaged. The German ship, meanwhile, continued her course toward France, her crew aware that they had survived one more attack, but knowing that others would follow as long as they remained at sea and within British reach. Throughout this period of intensifying pursuit, the British Admiralty's Signals Intelligence Section was working in parallel with the active naval forces. The German Navy, like all the combatant nations, relied on radio communications to coordinate its operations, and these communications were intercepted, routed to Bletchley Park, and decrypted with increasing efficiency as the war progressed. The Enigma intercepts that flowed from the cryptanalysts provided the Admiralty with tactical insights into German intentions, course changes, and damage reports. When Lütjens issued orders to his ships, when damage assessments were transmitted, when course corrections were made, these communications were frequently broken and read by British intelligence. It was this combination of human intelligence, reports from shadowing cruisers and reconnaissance aircraft, and signals intelligence that allowed Tovey to maintain a coherent strategic picture despite the fragmentary nature of tactical information. The work done by men in Hut 8 at Bletchley Park, though invisible to the gun crews aboard British ships and unseen by the pilots flying combat missions, was as essential to the hunt as any cannon or torpedo. The cruisers maintaining contact with Bismarck were themselves engaged in a dangerous play of proximity and survival. To keep the German ships in sight required closing to distances where they could themselves become targets for return fire. The British light and heavy cruisers that had been assigned this role understood the risk and accepted it with the professionalism expected of Royal Navy officers and men. They maintained their position despite poor visibility, despite German attempts to shake contact through radical course changes and evasive maneuvers, and despite the knowledge that Bismarck's guns, though damaged and potentially degraded in accuracy, remained formidable weapons. The cruiser's role was not to fight but to observe, to report, to keep the prey from vanishing into the immensity of the Atlantic before the main British battle fleet could close the distance. This required the kind of endurance and discipline that is easily overlooked in histories focused on the glamorous moments of gunfire and destruction. But it was precisely this steady, unglamorous persistence that made the entire hunt possible. The psychological dimension of the hunt was significant and worth understanding. For the British naval officer and sailor, the loss of Hood was not merely a tactical setback, but a violation of an assumed order. The Royal Navy had dominated the seas for more than a century. British ships had not been casually disposed of by German opponents in recent memory. Hood herself, launched before many of the men now serving in the fleet were born, represented continuity with that great tradition. Her loss to a single accurate hit, the image of her massive frame disappearing beneath the waves, created a burning determination that was channeled toward a single objective. Bismarck must pay for what she had done. This was not, of course, a rational response in the strategic sense. Ships were weapons, and weapons in warfare were destroyed. This was the nature of the contest. Yet human motivation rarely flows from pure rationality, and the British sailors and officers pursuing Bismarck were driven by something that transcended tactical necessity. They were driven by a need for justice, for vindication, for the reassertion of an order that had been violated. Admiral Tovey understood this motivation and did not attempt to suppress it. He channeled it instead into the focused, methodical pursuit of the German battleship. The broader coordination required to hunt Bismarck involved resources scattered across the entire North Atlantic theatre. Ships that had been assigned to other duties were recalled or redirected. The battleship HMS Ramillies, slower than the other capital ships but still capable, was positioned to cut off potential retreat routes. Destroyer flotillas were summoned from various stations and moved toward the expected intercept zone. Aircraft from multiple bases were launched on patrol missions, crisscrossing the ocean in search of the German ships. The tanker ships that supplied the pursuing British fleet were redirected to provide fuel at sea, extending the endurance of the hunter-killer force. The organization required to execute this kind of coordinated operation, to move dozens of ships, hundreds of men, thousands of tons of supplies into a coherent hunting formation, was a triumph of naval administration and logistics. It represented the infrastructure of sea power, not merely the visible ships and guns, but the invisible networks of communication, supply, repair, and command that allowed those ships and guns to be projected across vast distances and sustained in effective pursuit. As the afternoon of the 25th of May wore on, The British were gaining information that suggested Bismarck was in fact making for France, rather than attempting to break back into the Atlantic. Radio intercepts and the analysis of the German ship's course changes pointed toward this conclusion. Tovey adjusted his force dispositions accordingly, moving his battle fleet toward a point south and east of Bismarck's current position, attempting to cut off her escape route before she could reach French waters. The mathematics of the pursuit was becoming clearer, though still uncertain. Bismarck was moving faster than a full-power pursuit would suggest, given her stated damage. Perhaps the damage was less severe than initially believed, or perhaps her crew had executed temporary repairs that restored more power to her engines than expected. The British pursuit was being carried out at high speed and high fuel consumption, which meant that Tovey and his commanders would have a limited window in which to bring Bismarck to battle before their own fuel situation forced them to break off or reduce speed. This temporal dimension added urgency to every decision. The hunt was not merely a race across open ocean, but a race against the clock, against the mathematics of fuel consumption and nautical distance. The fragmentary reports that reached the Admiralty during this period included some that were misleading or false, a common occurrence in warfare when multiple sources provide information in real time and under conditions of stress and uncertainty. Some reports placed Bismarck further south than she actually was. Others suggested her speed was greater or less than the true figure. Each piece of information required interpretation, cross-referencing against other sources, and integration into a tactical picture. The duty officers at the Admiralty worked continuously, sometimes on incomplete sleep, sorting through the flood of reports and attempting to construct a coherent narrative from fragmentary pieces. Their work was complicated by the fact that some reports came from friendly vessels, some from intercepted enemy communications, some from air reconnaissance, and some from merchant ships that had observed the German fleet at a distance. Each source had different reliability. Each required context and interpretation. Yet despite this complexity, and despite the inevitable errors and misinterpretations that occurred, the Admiralty maintained its strategic clarity. Bismarck was damaged and must be prevented from reaching port. The determination visible in British actions during this phase of the pursuit was not merely a matter of tactical necessity, but of institutional will. The Royal Navy was the senior service in Britain, the force upon which the security of the nation and its empire had depended for centuries. The loss of Hood was a blow to institutional prestige and to the morale of men who believed in the superiority of British seamanship and British ships. The pursuit of Bismarck became a vehicle through which that institutional will could express itself, through which officers and men could reassert confidence in their service and in their ability to prosecute war at sea effectively. Admiral Tovey, issuing orders from his flagship, was not merely directing the movements of ships and the deployment of weapons. He was channeling the collective determination of an institution to restore the order that had been disturbed by the sinking of Hood. In this sense, the hunt for Bismarck was as much a matter of morale and institutional purpose as it was a matter of tactical calculation. The British Navy had been challenged and had responded with overwhelming force. The challenge would be met, and the German battleship would not escape. Chapter 10. Contact lost. In the hours following the engagement in the Denmark Strait, the North Atlantic had become a place of shadows and silence. The sea itself seemed to swallow certainty. On the morning of the 25th of May, 1941, the Bismarck and her solitary companion, the Prinz Eugen, were still alive, still moving, yet their location had become a question that no one in the British Admiralty could answer with confidence. Admiral Günther Lütjens, commanding the operation from Bismarck's bridge, understood the mathematics of his situation. The British had tasted his ship's guns and respected them, but they had not sunk him. More importantly, the damaged Prince of Wales had withdrawn. For the first time since the breakout from the Norwegian fjord, Lütjens possessed something he had not had before, a margin of time. He would use it to become a ghost on the water. The withdrawal of the Prince of Wales, damaged and outgunned, created a tactical vacuum that Lütjens immediately exploited. At approximately 0640 hours on the 25th, as the Bismarck steamed southwestward away from the Denmark Strait, the admiral made a decision that would ripple through British naval planning for the next 3 days. He ordered Prinz Eugen to detach and make independently for Saint-Nazaire, while Bismarck herself would continue on a diversionary course designed to draw British attention away from the French port. It was a calculated gamble. By splitting his force, Lütjens hoped to create confusion in the British pursuit. If the Royal Navy divided its assets attempting to track both ships, neither would have sufficient strength to overwhelm his now solitary battleship. If they pursued only the Bismarck, the Prinz Eugen would escape unscathed to France. The cruiser, her fuel situation less critical than the battleships, could afford to linger in the Atlantic and raid if opportunity presented itself, or move directly toward port if prudence demanded it. For 12 hours after the separation, the Royal Navy maintained occasional contact with the German ships. Aircraft reported sightings. Cruisers attempted to close. The great machinery of British Naval Command tried to knit together a coherent picture from fragmentary reports scattered across thousands of kilometers of grey ocean. But the vastness of the North Atlantic worked against visibility. Weather deteriorated. Visibility fell to mere kilometers. The Bismarck, moving at reduced speed due to her fuel leak, became harder to track precisely. At approximately 0900 hours on the 25th, contact was finally lost. The last British observation placed the Bismarck somewhere in the waters roughly 350 kilometers southwest of the point of impact in the Denmark Strait, moving on a course that suggested neither Norway nor the Mediterranean, but something more direct, something pointing toward France. The immediate reaction in the British Admiralty was not one of clarity, but one of spreading uncertainty. Admiral Tovey, commanding the home fleet, possessed excellent tactical information from the engagement itself, but now faced a problem that had defeated naval commanders for centuries, the problem of predicting where a skilled opponent would go when that opponent had time and space to maneuver. The Bismarck's fuel situation was known to be serious. Her forward tanks had been ruptured by Prince of Wales shells. This fact constrained her options, but it did not eliminate them entirely. She could make for occupied France, specifically Saint-Nazaire, where German naval facilities could effect repairs. She could attempt to reach Spain or Portugal, neutral nations where she might at least obtain temporary shelter and fuel. She could reverse course and make for Norway, where German bases existed in the occupied territories. She could even attempt to circle back toward home through Arctic waters. Each option had adherents among Tovey's officers. Each possibility spawned its own search patterns, and each distribution of British naval assets meant leaving another avenue unguarded. As the afternoon of the 25th progressed into evening, the Admiralty's strategic planning began to suffer under the weight of this ambiguity. Messages flew between operational headquarters and the scattered British task forces. Should Tovey commit his remaining capital ships to a northwesterly search toward the Arctic? Should he position them to cover a potential dash toward Spain? How many cruisers and destroyers should he leave to guard the convoy routes, and how many should he commit to the hunt? In the absence of firm intelligence about Bismarck's position and intended course, planning became reactive. British naval forces repositioned themselves based on possibilities rather than facts, spreading their strength across a wider area than any single search pattern would have demanded. The uncertainty, in other words, cost the Royal Navy efficiency, and efficiency in a pursuit is measured in kilometers, in fuel, in the closing of ranges that can mean the difference between capture and escape. Aboard the Bismarck herself, the atmosphere had shifted from the exhilaration of combat to something more complex. The ship's crew understood they had scored a tremendous victory. The Hood was dead, sunk so quickly and so completely that she had barely time to send a final message. But understanding was not the same as celebration. The damage sustained in the engagement was serious, and the men working below decks in the forward compartments could feel it in every riveted joint and every compartment they inspected. The forward fuel bunkers were compromised. Oil slicked the water in portions of the ship where oil had no business being. The engineering spaces reported ongoing efforts to seal and isolate the damaged sections. But the reality was that Bismarck's endurance was no longer a matter of theoretical calculation. It was now a matter of hours and kilometers. Captain Ernst Lindemann, commanding the battleship, understood this with the clarity that only a trained naval officer could muster. His ship remained the most powerful warship in the Atlantic, but she was no longer unlimited in her capacity to roam the seas at will. The night of the 25th descended upon the Atlantic like a curtain drawn across the stage. Radio discipline on both sides had become absolute. German ships maintained silence to avoid giving away their position through direction finding, and British vessels, knowing that enemy ships were out there somewhere in the darkness, proceeded with their own transmissions reduced to essential traffic only. In this radio silence, a peculiar form of intelligence warfare unfolded. The British, through signals intelligence gathered at Bletchley Park, and through direction-finding stations scattered along the British Isles and in occupied territories, maintained a parallel struggle. When the Germans transmitted, even briefly, British operators noted the bearing and strength of the signal. Enigma encrypted messages, when decrypted, provided glimpses into German intentions, though these glimpses were always hours old by the time they were read and acted upon. The Bismarck and Prinz Eugen, even in radio silence, could not hide themselves entirely. Their very existence as electromagnetic presences betrayed them to the specialized ears of Britain's Signals Intelligence Service. As dawn broke on the 26th of May, the British still did not possess a definitive answer to the question of where the Bismarck had gone. Nearly 31 hours had passed since last visual contact with the German battleship. In that time, she had travelled more than 450 kilometers from her last reported position, and the search area had expanded exponentially. Ships dispatched to investigate one possibility had not found the quarry and had expended fuel doing so. The Admiralty's planning had developed a faint but growing note of desperation. Aircraft had been sent out in widening search patterns. Cruisers had been positioned in an attempted barrier formation across the approaches to the Atlantic, like fishermen hoping to intercept a salmon swimming upstream. Yet the ocean remained vast, and the Bismarck, like a grey phantom, had seemed to vanish into it. But the break in British knowledge was not a break in the reality of the situation. The Bismarck existed still, moving through waters that were being actively searched. The difference was that her pursuers had lost visual confirmation of her position, and in the era before radar became truly reliable and widespread, visual confirmation, or radio intelligence, was often the only concrete data available. What was happening, in the hours between the loss of contact and the eventual rediscovery, was a process of deduction and assumption. Admiral Lutyens, aware that he was being hunted and uncertain of the precise disposition of British forces, was making his own calculations. The shortest route to Saint-Nazaire lay generally southwestward and then southeast, a course that would take him across the Bay of Biscay eventually. This was the route that offered him the greatest probability of reaching a French port while expending the minimum amount of fuel. It was also the route that British naval planning had, in some quarters, already begun to consider as the most likely option. On the Admiralty's maps, the theoretical position of the Bismarck was marked not with certainty, but with question marks and circles indicating the area of likely positions based on speed assumptions and course possibilities. But the question of how much fuel the German battleship had consumed, how fast she was actually traveling, and what route she had chosen remained open to debate. Conservative estimates suggested she was moving slowly, trying to conserve fuel. Other assessments suggested she was pushing hard to create distance between herself and her pursuers. The range of possibilities created a cone of uncertainty that expanded hourly. Yet within that uncertainty, British officers who understood naval tactics and German psychology were beginning to form a consensus. The Bismarck, they reasoned, would not turn north toward Norway. That would require her to traverse waters already being actively searched. She would not attempt to reach the Mediterranean. That route was even longer and offered no protected anchorages. She would make for France. The question was not whether she would attempt to reach Saint-Nazaire, but when. The night of the 26th of May had turned the hunters and hunted into parallel participants in a strange and deadly game of timing and fortune. Somewhere in the darkness, the Bismarck was steaming southwestward, her captain and admiral aware that they possessed perhaps one more night, possibly one more day, before the British would relocate them and bring their overwhelming forces to bear. The British, scattered across millions of square kilometers of ocean, were trying to close the net they had spread, hoping that even without direct contact, they could position themselves to intercept before the German battleship reached the relative safety of occupied French waters and the air cover they would provide. The hunter had become the hunted once more, but the hunted had also become the hunter in a reciprocal transformation that only the vast Atlantic could nurture. Contact had been lost, certainty had been fractured, but the chase had not ended. It had only changed character, becoming less a matter of seeing and firing, and more a matter of prediction and calculation. As that night settled over the Atlantic, Admiral Lütjens remained on the bridge of his crippled flagship, watching the darkness and calculating the time remaining. He knew that his breaking contact was temporary, an opening that he was exploiting but could not forever maintain. The British were too thorough, too distributed, and too determined to allow a damaged German battleship to slip through their grasp indefinitely. Yet those hours of invisibility, those 31 hours when the Bismarck had ceased to be a confirmed target and had become instead a theoretical position on a chart, had given him something precious, the possibility of reaching Saint-Nazaire. The mathematics was becoming clear to him, hour by hour. If the rudder could be repaired once he had sufficient time, if British forces did not intercept him during the remaining night and the following dawn, if the Prinz Eugen had successfully detached and would not betray his position through her own movements, then perhaps, just perhaps, the Bismarck might escape this trap. The realization was both comforting and illusory. The net was closing. The hunter and the hunted were on converging paths, and the meeting, when it came, would be neither gentle nor forgiving. In the hours following Bismarck's damage to her fuel tanks, the British Naval Command faced a calculation that hinged entirely on speed and positioning. The wounded German battleship was moving toward Saint-Nazaire at a reduced pace, traveling roughly toward the southwest, but the distance to safety remained vast. More than 2,000 kilometers still lay ahead. Admiral Tovey's battle fleet was advancing from the north and west, but the geometry of the Atlantic offered no guarantees. The key to British success lay not with the capital ships, which were still hours away, but with the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, positioned approximately 400 kilometers to the south and east of Bismarck's course. The Ark Royal represented the future of naval warfare, though many senior officers of the old guard still believed in battleships as the ultimate arbiters of sea power. On the morning of the 26th of May, as Bismarck limped southwest under grey and increasingly turbulent skies, the Ark Royal's commanding officer, Captain Loban Holland, recognized that his ship and her aircraft represented the only real opportunity to slow the German battleship before she could reach the protective umbrella of French air cover and coastal defenses. What followed was one of the most consequential carrier aviation operations of the early war years, a moment that would hinge not on technical perfection, but on audacity, luck, and the willingness to operate in conditions that bordered on impossible. The Ark Royal herself was a veteran of 3 years of war. Completed in 1938, she displaced 22,000 tons and carried a complement of roughly 60 aircraft, though never all of them operational simultaneously. Her aircraft were the Fairy Swordfish, biplanes that seemed anachronistic even for 1941, with their fabric-covered wings and open cockpits. These machines were slow, vulnerable to fighter opposition, and by any modern standard appeared obsolete. Yet the Swordfish possessed one virtue that mattered above all others. They could carry a torpedo, and they could deliver it with remarkable precision when flown by experienced crews. The Ark Royal's pilots were, on the whole, experienced men who had served through the Mediterranean campaign and various engagements off Norway. They understood their aircraft's limitations and had learned to operate within them, using darkness, poor visibility, and sheer determination as their allies. As word came through on the morning of the 26th that Bismarck remained within striking range, though at the outer limit of operational radius, Captain Holland made the decision to launch an attack despite weather conditions that were deteriorating steadily. The seas were running heavy, the cloud cover was thick and broken, visibility was reduced by rain squalls, and the wind was gusting strongly enough to make flight operations hazardous. Yet Holland recognized that this might be the only opportunity before Bismarck either reached French airspace or inflicted sufficient damage on British pursuers to break free entirely. The order went out to prepare the Swordfish for launching. Below decks, in the narrow confines of the Ark Royal's ready rooms and hangars, crews began their familiar rituals of preparation. Aircraft mechanics checked engines, inspected fuel systems, and armed the torpedoes, weighty, finicky weapons that required careful handling. The pilots, dressed in their flight gear and life jackets, received their final briefing from the navigation officer and squadron commander. The route to Bismarck would take them southwest, roughly 120 to 140 kilometers, into worsening conditions. The window of attack was narrow. They would need to locate the German ship visually through broken cloud cover, coordinate their approach to maximize the chance of a hit, and then return to the Ark Royal before their fuel reserves became dangerously low. Every calculation was based on estimates and assumptions. No one knew the exact position of Bismarck with absolute certainty. Radio direction finding equipment provided rough bearings, but aircraft spotting reports could be hours old. The pilots would need to search, and that searching would consume precious fuel. The weather forecast was grim. The conditions were growing worse by the hour. Yet the pilots knew also that this represented something larger than a single tactical action. The loss of the Hood had shocked the Royal Navy into a determination that bordered on obsession. If this attack failed, Bismarck would likely escape. If it succeeded, it might change everything. The tension in the ready rooms was palpable, though outwardly masked by the professionalism and dark humor that aircrew cultivated as a defense against fear. At approximately 2:20 in the afternoon, on the 26th of May, the first Swordfish launched from the Ark Royal's flight deck. The biplanes, heavily laden with fuel and weaponry, struggled into the air in the gusty, moisture-laden wind. One after another, they lifted off and formed into loose formations, then turned southwest toward the distant enemy. Roughly 15 aircraft launched in total, a modest force by later standards, but representing the entirety of what Captain Holland could spare and what weather conditions would permit. The pilots climbed through cloud, sometimes losing sight of one another, navigating by compass and dead reckoning across a grey, turbulent sea. The visibility was abysmal. Rain squalls reduced sight lines to mere hundreds of meters in some cases. The cloud base forced them to fly at low altitude, which was both tactically useful for launching an attack and strategically dangerous, as it prevented them from seeing the full tactical picture. Yet this was the nature of early carrier aviation. Primitive by later standards, yet demanding complete commitment and skill from men flying by instinct and training in conditions that stretched both aircraft and aircrew to their limits. The search pattern was designed to sweep the likely course of the German ship, but as the Swordfish flew on, minute after minute, some pilots began to wonder if they had misjudged the position. Fuel was burning steadily. Minutes accumulated. The deadline for turning back to ensure sufficient fuel to return to the Ark Royal was approaching. Then, suddenly, emerging from a rain squall, a massive silhouette appeared, the shape of a large warship, unmistakably the Bismarck, her superstructure distinctive even through the poor visibility. The moment of sighting triggered immediate tactical action. The Swordfish pilots needed to coordinate their attack swiftly before the German ship's anti-aircraft gunners could respond effectively. The biplanes began their approach runs, coming in low over the heaving Atlantic swells, their engines straining, their pilots concentrating intensely on flying a stable platform from which to launch their torpedoes. The German battleship's defenses came alive immediately. Anti-aircraft guns erupted across her superstructure, rapid-fire weapons sending streams of tracer ammunition toward the incoming aircraft. The sky around the Swordfish erupted with flak, shells bursting in clouds of grey and black smoke. The British pilots pressed on, committed to their attack runs, knowing that turning back now would waste the entire operation. The torpedo runs were conducted from notably low altitude, sometimes mere meters above the wave tops. A pilot would level his aircraft, stabilize his approach, and release the heavy torpedo, which would drop with a splash into the sea and then, hopefully, track toward the target. The physics of torpedo attack were relatively simple, but the execution under fire, in poor visibility, and in deteriorating weather, required nerves of exceptional steel. The Bismarck was maneuvering now, attempting to comb the torpedo tracks, to turn in such a way that the weapons would pass harmlessly astern or ahead. Captain Lindemann on the bridge was calling out course changes, trying to evade the incoming weapons. The ship was twisting and turning in the heavy seas, her massive hull responding sluggishly to her rudder. Most of the torpedoes, as the action unfolded, in fact passed harmlessly. The sea was rough, the visibility poor, and the coordination required to synchronize multiple attacking aircraft was imperfect. Yet one Swordfish pilot, whose aircraft and crew would enter history without universally agreed identification, whether the aircraft was flown by Lieutenant Commander John Slattery, Eugene Esmond, or another pilot, remains a matter of historical dispute, managed to achieve what fortune and skill could deliver. His torpedo, released at the correct moment from the correct angle, struck the Bismarck's stern on the starboard quarter. The impact was not a tremendous explosion. It lacked the apocalyptic violence of the hit that had destroyed the hood. Instead, it was a heavy shock, a violent disturbance of water and steel. The torpedo struck the Bismarck's stern section, damaging the ship's steering gear assembly. The rudder, struck by the weapon or jammed by the structural damage that radiated outward from the impact, became locked in a position roughly 10 degrees to starboard. The mechanical linkages that controlled the rudder, the hydraulic systems, the backup systems, all were damaged beyond immediate repair. The implications were catastrophic for the German battleship's escape plan. A battleship of Bismarck's size and power was designed to maneuver, to turn, to change course in coordinated patterns with other ships, or to evade incoming fire. With her rudder jammed, she could no longer perform these fundamental actions. Instead, she was forced to advance in a direction that was not toward her intended destination. With the rudder locked to starboard, the ship began to describe a wide, circular pattern, turning in a manner that had not been chosen by her captain, but rather had been imposed by mechanical failure and the skill of a single British torpedo pilot. The Swordfish, having delivered their attack, turned back toward the Ark Royal. Some were damaged by anti-aircraft fire. Some had burned significant fuel reserves in their extended search. The flight back to the carrier was tense and tiring for men who had just endured one of the most consequential moments of their service. When they recovered aboard the Ark Royal, landing on a pitching flight deck in deteriorating weather, the pilots reported that they believed they had achieved at least one hit. Confirmation came rapidly through radio reports from British cruisers maintaining contact with Bismarck. The German ship had changed course, was moving in an erratic pattern, and had significantly reduced speed. Whether through damage assessment or radio intelligence decryption, the British command understood within hours that the attack had achieved the seemingly impossible. Bismarck's rudder was damaged. She was crippled. The impact on the strategic situation was immediate and profound. Until the moment of the torpedo strike, Bismarck had possessed the possibility of escape. She was damaged, yes, but she remained capable of making high speed towards Saint-Nazaire, where repair facilities and German air cover could protect her. The distance to safety had been closing steadily. With her rudder jammed, all of that calculation changed. A battleship that could not turn effectively was a battleship that could not fight or maneuver in the tactical sense. Admiral Lütjens, commanding the operation, understood immediately the gravity of the situation. His ship was now effectively doomed unless she could either repair her steering in the brief window remaining before British capital ships arrived, or unless German forces from France could come out to meet her and fight the British battle fleet. He signaled Berlin with terse communications that reflected his understanding that Operation Rheinübung had transformed from a bold commerce-raiding operation into a battle for survival. Captain Lindemann, commanding Bismarck herself, initiated damage control operations below decks. Men were sent into the compartments containing the steering gear to assess what could be repaired. The damage was severe. The torpedo had struck in such a way that the mechanical and hydraulic connections that controlled the rudder were compromised. Repair would be extraordinarily difficult. The ship was moving, rolling in heavy seas, and the compartment where the repairs needed to take place was subject to shock and vibration from the ship's motion. Yet Lindemann ordered the work to continue, driving his crew to work frantically in the confined spaces, using manual methods and improvised repairs to attempt to restore even partial steering capability. The sea around Bismarck was no longer empty. The British destroyers and cruisers that had been maintaining contact throughout the chase were now converging. The crippled battleship, moving in her wide, circular course, was becoming less a fugitive fleeing and more a wounded animal at bay. The weather was deteriorating further. The wind was strengthening, the seas were growing heavier, and night was approaching. The British commanding officers understood that they now possessed a genuine chance to bring Bismarck to action before she could either escape or repair herself. The distance between the German battleship and the British battle fleet, HMS Rodney and HMS King George V, was narrowing steadily. Where hours before there had been genuine uncertainty about whether the British could catch their prey, there was now confidence bordering on certainty. The Ark Royal's pilots, having delivered their attack, had transformed the entire nature of the pursuit. What had been a race across open water, where speed and luck might have favored escape, had become a closing trap where the mathematics of distance and time now favored the hunter. The myth of Bismarck's invulnerability, which had seemed so solid in the clear light of her victory over the Hood, had begun to crack. The ship that had seemed unsinkable had proven vulnerable to the most unexpected threat, not to battleship gunnery or fleet action, but to a handful of slow, fabric-covered biplanes launched from a carrier in deteriorating weather conditions by pilots willing to attack overwhelming odds. As darkness fell on the 26th of May, Bismarck's situation had become untenable. She was crippled, unable to maneuver effectively. She was surrounded by British naval units that were only growing more numerous. Her escape to Saint-Nazaire, which had seemed probable only hours earlier, now appeared impossible. The repair work on her rudder was progressing, but no one aboard the German battleship harbored serious illusions that it could be completed in time to allow her to escape before British capital ships arrived. The night would be crucial. In the darkness, there might be opportunities for the Ark Royal's aircraft to attack again. British destroyers would close in for night attacks with their torpedoes. The crew of the Bismarck, which had begun the operation in a state of confidence verging on certainty about their ship's invincibility, was now facing the prospect of a final battle against overwhelming odds. The transformation from hunter to hunted, from confident aggressor to desperate defender, had been accomplished in a single afternoon by a handful of British pilots, and the courage it took to press home an attack in conditions that could only be described as terrible. The torpedo that had found its mark in the Bismarck's stern had done more than damage the ship's steering. It had transformed the nature of the entire operation, turning what remained of it into a countdown toward an inevitable confrontation from which there could be no escape. As the sun descended toward the western horizon on the evening of the 26th of May 1941, the Atlantic Ocean transformed from a hunting ground into a stage set for the final act of a tragedy that all aboard the Bismarck now understood was drawing inexorably toward its conclusion. The great battleship, crippled by the torpedo strike that had jammed her rudder just hours earlier, wallowed in heavy seas with her stern swinging uselessly in wide, unpredictable arcs. The crew, more than 2,000 men confined within her steel hull, existed in a state of suspended disbelief, caught between the pride of serving aboard the most powerful warship in the world and the creeping awareness that their invulnerability had been an illusion shattered in seconds by a single lucky hit from an aircraft they had not even seen clearly. The ship that had seemed designed by fate to rule the Atlantic now moved through the water like a wounded animal, powerful but helpless, dangerous but doomed. Above the constant groaning of tortured metal and the rush of seawater through ruptured compartments, there was the knowledge that British destroyers and cruisers were maintaining position in the gathering darkness, waiting, watching, shadowing their prey as night fell and the temperature dropped, and the men aboard Bismarck faced the reality that dawn would bring their final ordeal. Below the waterline, in compartments that existed as a world of twisted piping, electrical conduits, and emergency lighting that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow, German sailors and naval engineers moved through water that had flooded several sections to waist height, their movements slowed by exhaustion and the weight of their saturated uniforms. They had been working for hours in near darkness, feeling their way through compartments where orientation became disorienting after only minutes of concentration, searching for the damage control mechanisms that might somehow free the jammed rudder or at least stabilize the ship's erratic heading. The torpedo that had struck the stern had detonated with a force that killed men instantly in some compartments and left others unscathed, that destroyed mechanisms that had taken engineers months to assemble with precision and left other systems mysteriously functioning as though touched by a reprieve that would prove only temporary. The men working below could not see the British ships that circled their vessel like wolves, could not perceive the radar signals that penetrated the darkness, could not know with certainty whether they labored towards salvation or merely delayed the inevitable by minutes or hours. What they possessed instead was the discipline of the Kriegsmarine, the training that had been drilled into them during years of service, and a determination born not from propaganda or ideology, but from the simple human instinct to survive and to do their duty to the men serving alongside them. Some worked in near silence, conserving energy and breath in air that grew progressively more foul as the ventilation systems struggled against damage and the sheer number of men breathing in confined spaces. Others whispered encouragement or offered water from canteens when men showed signs of faltering, small gestures of humanity in an environment that had become almost inhospitable to human life. The struggle to repair or stabilize the rudder became a battle against physics and the overwhelming momentum of a ship weighing 41,000 tons, moving through water at considerable speed despite her damaged state. The engineers who descended into the steering gear compartment encountered a scene of destruction where the torpedo's blast had twisted metal supports and sheared bolts with the casual force of a giant crushing small objects. The rudder itself, a massive control surface normally responsive to the touch of the men in the conning tower far above, had become locked in a position that forced Bismarck into a wide, uncontrollable port turn, a circular path that the captain was forced to maintain because any attempt to alter course dramatically at speed threatened to tear the weakened stern section apart entirely. The men working on repairs understood that even success would be limited. At best, they might regain enough control to proceed in a straighter line, to perhaps reach the French coast where repair facilities might accomplish what temporary measures could not. At worst, their labor served only to preserve the ship long enough for the inevitable confrontation that awaited when dawn broke and British battleships appeared over the horizon. Yet they worked, because working was their responsibility and their only option beyond despair, because stopping meant accepting defeat before the battle was fought, because German sailors did not surrender to circumstance, while strength remained in their bodies and hope, however faint, remained in their minds. The temperature in the steering compartment hovered just above freezing, and men moved with movements that became increasingly sluggish as the night deepened and fatigue accumulated on top of the shock and fear and the physical demands of labor in conditions that tested human endurance. The water that flooded the compartments was Baltic Sea water, cold enough to induce hypothermia in anyone who remained submerged for extended periods, and several men showed signs of the dangerous confusion that preceded the final stages of that condition, speaking in slurred sentences about home and families and places they would never see again. Above deck, on the superstructure that had once been a symbol of German engineering and power, the crew prepared for battle, with the grim knowledge that morning would bring not a fair fight, but an execution. The anti-aircraft gun crews, men who had trained for weeks to coordinate their fire against enemy aircraft, now faced the probability that they would spend their final moments directing their weapons against targets so distant that their chances of scoring hits were negligible to non-existent. The damage control parties moved through the ship's corridors carrying medical supplies, ammunition, and replacement personnel to the gun turrets and fire control stations, aware that many of the men they passed would not survive the approaching day. The officers who walked the decks maintained a facade of calm efficiency, passing along orders and encouragement while internally grappling with the knowledge that no amount of tactical skill or seamanship could overcome the fundamental disadvantage they now faced. A ship, unable to maneuver, facing a fleet that possessed speed, firepower, and the element of surprise. Some men wrote letters, knowing that they would be found after death and delivered to families across Germany by military couriers who had performed that task countless times during the 5 years of war. Others simply stood in silence on the exposed upper works, feeling the wind that carried the salt spray and the cold, watching the lights of the shadowing British destroyers that remained visible in the darkness, twin beacons of mortality positioned at relatively close range. The watches changed at their appointed times despite the apocalyptic circumstances, because the Kriegsmarine observed protocols and procedures as though normalcy could be maintained through adherence to routine, as though the rituals of naval life might somehow provide protection against the forces that descended upon them. Captain Ernst Lindemann remained in the conning tower throughout the evening, a presence both reassuring and deeply troubling to the men who passed through the compartment or received orders transmitted from that position. He had commanded Bismarck since her commissioning, had trained this crew, had embodied the confidence that had characterized the ship's early operations when it seemed that technical superiority and aggressive tactics might tip the scales of war toward German advantage. Now he moved through the compartment with the bearing of a commanding officer, while his mind processed calculations that all pointed toward the same conclusion: that the ship which had cost the Reich millions of marks and years of engineering effort would likely be at the bottom of the Atlantic before this month ended. He issued orders regarding the rudder repairs, approved damage control recommendations, and maintained the appearance of command, while knowing that decisions made by him or Admiral Lütjens no longer held significant bearing on outcomes that appeared to be determined by forces beyond human control. He did not discuss his thoughts with his officers, maintaining the distance that tradition demanded between a captain and his crew, yet those officers understood from his bearing and the tone of his voice that their commander had accepted what was coming with the equanimity that German naval tradition demanded of its leaders. Lindemann had studied naval history. He knew how battles were lost and how ships died, and he had prepared himself intellectually for scenarios that he had hoped would never transition from the realm of theory to the reality of lived experience. The men under his command perceived his resignation without words being exchanged, understood that he was not preparing for escape or miraculous salvation, but for the performance of duty until circumstances made further performance impossible. Admiral Günther Lütjens, whose strategic miscalculation in pressing towards Saint-Nazaire, rather than attempting to break away into open ocean, now appeared in harsh clarity to everyone aboard, maintained his position as commander of the operation, despite the fact that command now consisted largely of making peace with decisions that could not be unmade, and ordering the men under his authority to prepare for the end with dignity and discipline. He had gambled on speed and darkness, and on the assumption that British pursuit would falter before Bismarck reached the protection of German-controlled ports and air cover. That gamble had failed because of a single torpedo, because of circumstances that no amount of planning could have completely accounted for, because the nature of naval warfare in 1941 included factors, aircraft, radar, coordinated multi-ship tactics, that had rendered the strategic assumptions underlying Operation Rheinübung obsolete almost as soon as they had been committed to paper. Lütjens was not a man given to public despair, yet his officers noticed that he moved through the ship with the manner of someone who had already lived through defeat in his mind, and was now simply enduring the time before that defeat became official and irreversible. He transmitted radio messages to German naval headquarters reporting the situation, knowing that those messages would be intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, that the information was simultaneously accurate and strategically useless because there was nothing the German Admiralty could do to alter circumstances that had already been determined by physics and the relative positioning of ships across several hundred kilometers of Atlantic Ocean. As midnight approached, the night became total, unrelieved by any moon or starlight, the darkness complete enough that men could barely distinguish their shipmates standing beside them, the British destroyers visible only as running lights maintained at distances that seemed calculated to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing risk to the shadowing vessels. The German crew worked through that darkness with a focus that transcended fear, driven by training and by the particular form of discipline that the Kriegsmarine instilled in its personnel, but also by something more fundamental, the human desire to perform one's duty regardless of outcome, to maintain standards and dignity even when circumstances suggested that such maintenance was ultimately meaningless. The men in the engine rooms maintained the massive Krupp-built turbines that drove the ship through water, knowing that those engines had been designed and built by German engineers working months ago under completely different assumptions about the future. The men in the ammunition magazines passed shells from storage racks to the loading mechanisms of the big guns, shells that might or might not be fired in anger before the magazine itself disappeared beneath the surface of the sea. The signalmen maintained radio watches, receiving and transmitting messages that chronicled the progress of pursuit and the gradually narrowing options available to the men aboard the crippled ship. The medical personnel prepared surgical suites and triage areas, laying out bandages and instruments that would be employed tomorrow in attempting to save men who had suffered wounds from weapons that inflicted trauma on a scale that exceeded what surgical intervention could address. The ship itself groaned and shifted in the heavy seas, the damaged stern section flexing in ways that revealed the extent of the structural compromise, sounds that some men interpreted as signs of progressive degradation that might result in the ship breaking apart even if British gunnery proved less lethal than anticipated. The long night proceeded with an almost dreamlike quality, suspended between the horror of what had already occurred, the loss of HMS Hood, the death of 1,318 British sailors whose families would soon receive notifications that their husbands and sons and fathers would not be returning home, and the horror that awaited when dawn broke, and 2 full British battleships joined the destroyers and cruisers that already encircled the dying German warship. Conversations aboard Bismarck took on the character of men who were engaging in the ritual of normalcy while simultaneously accepting that normalcy had ended, that the world had bifurcated into a before and an after, with the moment of transition located somewhere in the approaching hours of daylight. Some men spoke about the war, about whether Germany could possibly recover from the losses accumulated over the preceding 2 years of fighting on multiple fronts, about whether the strategic situation was as dire as the facts of the matter seemed to suggest. Others engaged in the simpler conversations of men waiting for death, discussions about food and women, and the peculiar experiences of service at sea that had become the sum total of their lives. Still others maintained silence, moving through their duties with an efficiency that owed nothing to conscious thought, that represented instead the automaticity of training applied in circumstances where conscious thought would have led only to paralysis. The crews in the gun turrets maintained their weapons, performing the rituals of verification and preparation that were part of standard procedures, actions that were simultaneously utterly pointless and absolutely essential to the maintenance of military order. The big 15-inch guns of Bismarck's main armament had been responsible for the destruction of HMS Hood just 2 days earlier, had demonstrated a lethality and accuracy that had seemed to confirm the propaganda about German engineering and German naval power. Now those same guns would be directed against British battleships that possessed equivalent firepower and superior ability to maneuver, ships whose crews had spent the preceding days nursing their rage over the loss of the Hood and preparing for this final engagement with the determination of men who had been dealt a grievous wound and now possessed the opportunity to exact retaliation. The gun crews knew that they would perform their duties with efficiency and precision because that was what training demanded, because that was what honor demanded, because to do otherwise would be to surrender the dignity that was perhaps the only thing remaining to men who faced circumstances they could not control and outcomes they could not alter. The final hours of that night were experienced by different men in different ways, depending on their location within the ship, their knowledge of naval operations, and their personal capacity to accept the trajectory of events that circumstance had imposed upon them. Some men attempted to sleep despite the discomfort and the noise and the pervading sense of doom, finding in sleep a temporary refuge from the psychological burden of waiting. Others could not sleep, remained awake in compartments that would soon be their tombs, minds active with thoughts about lives not fully lived and opportunities that would never be realized. The officers maintained their watches and their duties, preserving the structure of command and communication that would remain operative until the moment when the ship's power sources failed or the final direct hit rendered such structure meaningless. The engineers continued their efforts to stabilize the rudder and restore some measure of maneuverability, working in compartments that seemed increasingly fragile, where water continued to seep through damaged bulkheads and electrical fires burned in locations where water and damaged wiring intersected. The night deepened toward the false dawn that precedes true sunrise, that period of increasing light that would reveal the full extent of the British dispositions and would transform the shadowing destroyers and cruisers into the agents of their final destruction rather than merely the agents of pursuit. Every man aboard Bismarck understood, in the way that the night of the 26th of May surrenders to dawn with terrible inevitability. The sea, which had offered concealment and distance, now becomes an accomplice to Bismarck's exposure. All through the darkness, British destroyers and cruisers had maintained their vigil around the crippled battleship, closing slowly, methodically, like wolves that know the prey can no longer outrun them. The German crew had labored ceaselessly in the ship's flooded compartments, attempting to coax the jammed rudder back into working order, but the sea had already made its judgment. Water filled the steering compartments faster than the damage control parties could work. By dawn, Captain Ernst Lindemann understood what every officer on the bridge had come to accept. The Bismarck would fight her last battle without the ability to maneuver, anchored to her fate as surely as if iron chains held her in place. The ship that had been designed to dominate any engagement through superior firepower and speed now faced the prospect of standing still while British shells found their mark. In the pre-dawn grey, As lookouts scanned the horizon, the silhouettes appeared, first one, then another. The forms resolved into the unmistakable profiles of battleships. HMS Rodney, an older vessel but formidable, and HMS King George V, the newest dreadnought of the Royal Navy. They were not alone. Behind them, other warships took their positions. The British had assembled overwhelming force. The time for evasion, for negotiation with circumstances, had ended. At 08:47 hours, when the sun had climbed high enough to cast long shadows across the steel decks, the order passed through Bismarck's gunnery system. The fire control officers, operating in compartments below the waterline, directed the guns toward the British battleships. They had only their calculations, only their training, only the faint radio signals that told them where the enemy lay. The first salvo erupted from Bismarck's forward turrets, 8 15-inch shells weighing nearly 7 tons each, hurling themselves across the void. The British ships were at extreme range, more than 24,000 meters away, so distant that the shells would take more than a minute to complete their journey. But the range was theoretical, academic. The German gunners, without a functioning steering system to move their ship, could not adjust their aim to bracket the targets properly. Their ship wallowed in the seaway, responding to waves and wind rather than to the helmsman's intention. The first salvo missed, so did the second. The British, observing these harmless eruptions, began their response. When they opened fire, they did so with the weight of nations behind them. The British bombardment commenced at ranges that represented the outer edge of effective naval gunnery. HMS Rodney's 15-inch guns and HMS King George V's 14-inch weapons spoke in sustained, methodical volleys. The shells, traveling at velocities that pushed them beyond the speed of sound for much of their flight, descended upon the Bismarck with terrible purpose. The first hits came almost immediately, impacts that shook the entire ship, reverberations that traveled through steel and human flesh alike. The German sailors who had survived the long night of waiting now faced the violence they had known was coming. In the upper works, in the gun turrets and the bridge, in the fire control stations and the engine rooms far below, men experienced the sensation of their ship being struck by invisible giants. Each impact sent shock waves through compartments, knocked men from their feet, fractured nerves already stretched taut by exhaustion and fear. The superstructure, which had seemed so solid when the Bismarck was first commissioned, revealed itself to be merely a collection of steel plates, inadequate to withstand this weight of firepower. Armor, designed to protect against distant bombardment, did little to protect the upper works, the command centers, the antenna arrays that transmitted the ship's position and received the orders that no longer mattered. The return fire from Bismarck grew increasingly sporadic and inaccurate. The German gunnery officer, with every tool of modern fire control at his disposal, found himself unable to use them. The British ships moved, adjusted their positions, maneuvered to bring fresh gun batteries to bear. The Bismarck could not follow these movements. She drifted in her aimless circle, presenting now her port side, now her starboard, wallowing like a dying whale. The fire control systems, designed for precision at enormous distances, became useless when the firing platform itself refused to maintain a steady course. The last accurate salvo from the German battleship had been hours earlier, before the day broke, before the British battle line had closed to decisive range. Now, as the morning wore on and the shells continued to fall, Bismarck's guns fell silent one by one. Some were damaged by British hits. Others ran out of ammunition as supply lines within the ship were cut by explosions. Still others were abandoned by crews who realized that their efforts were making no difference. that they were simply presenting themselves as targets for British retribution. The superstructure of the Bismarck became a world of destruction. The fire control tower, which had housed the nerve center of the ship's gunnery system, took a direct hit that killed the spotting officers who had guided the ship's fire throughout the operation. The radio antenna masts, which had transmitted the reports that brought the Royal Navy down upon them, were twisted into useless tangles. The bridge itself, where Captain Lindemann stood observing his ship's final moments, was struck repeatedly. The captain's quarters, his cabin where he had studied the charts that promised safe passage to Saint-Nazaire, were engulfed in flames. The ship's superstructure burned with an intensity that seemed impossible, yet the flames fed on fuel oil that had leaked from ruptured tanks, on paint and canvas, on the accumulated detritus of a military warship. Through the smoke and flame, the British gunners could see that their shells were finding their target with increasing regularity. The British ships, moving closer, taking up positions that would have been suicidal against a functional enemy, now simply maneuvered to bring their entire broadsides to bear against a target that could no longer escape them. Below decks, the situation had become nightmare. The compartments that housed the engine rooms and boiler rooms, the spaces where hundreds of men worked in normal circumstances to keep the massive ship moving through the water, became chambers of death. Steam pipes ruptured, spraying superheated vapor that scalded men where they stood. Bulkheads collapsed under the weight of water that poured through holes opened by British shells. The damage control parties, heroic in their efforts, found themselves fighting not just the damage, but the physics of a ship that was taking on water faster than they could possibly pump it out. The list increased with each passing minute. The Bismarck, which had floated so proudly when she first put to sea, began to tilt, slowly at first, then with increasing insistence. Men who had been working in horizontal compartments found themselves climbing toward open air as the angle of the deck changed. Some made it to the upper levels, others did not. The interior of the battleship became a maze in which up and down lost their meaning, where the only compass was the direction the ship was leaning. The British continued their bombardment with a kind of industrial relentlessness. Admiral Tovey, commanding the home fleet from aboard the King George V, faced a practical problem. His ships were running low on ammunition. The battle that had seemed inevitable when Bismarck was discovered days earlier now faced a new constraint. The British gunners could not continue indefinitely. There was discussion of ramming the damaged battleship, of using the ships themselves as weapons, of ending the battle through collision rather than gunnery. But there was no need. The Bismarck was already finished. The only question remaining was how long the process of her ending would take. Throughout the morning, the shells continued to fall. The ship's list grew more pronounced. The fires burned hotter and more extensive. The gun turrets, those massive steel monsters that had cost fortunes to build and equip, sat silent and useless. The crew, what remained of the crew that had not been killed by the bombardment, began the process of abandoning ship. The order came to scuttle her, to open the seacocks, and ensure that if the ship would not sink from British shells, she would sink from her own hand. Whether this was mercy, whether this was an act of will, whether Bismarck sank from the accumulation of torpedo damage and shell fire, or from the deliberate actions of her own crew, would remain a point of historical debate. In that moment, the distinction did not matter to the men struggling in the cold Atlantic water. The final minutes of the Bismarck came not as a clean sinking, but as a prolonged surrender to the sea. The ship, with her list growing more severe, her engines long since shut down, her upper works ravaged, developed an angle that became impossible to maintain. The sea poured over her rails. Men clinging to what remained of the superstructure slid off into the water. The ship's hull, that incredible piece of engineering that had taken so many months to construct at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg, began to roll. The massive weight of the battleship, sitting low in the water with flooded compartments, created forces that no structure could resist. The Bismarck rolled further, exposing her starboard side to the sky, revealing the torpedo damage along her keel, the scars of the encounter with the Ark Royal's swordfish. The stern rose higher and higher into the air. For a moment, the entire length of the ship was visible, a monument to engineering and human ambition tilting toward the vertical. The bow, the massive bow that had cut through the North Sea just days before, pointed downward toward the abyss. There was a sound that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives, a groaning of metal, a shriek of rivets giving way, a sound like the death cry of something vast and ancient. The Bismarck, at 10 hours and 39 minutes on the 27th of May 1941, slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The British gunners ceased fire. The bombardment stopped. The scene that remained was not one of triumph, but of devastation. The sea, which moments before had been churned by the impact of thousands of shells, began to calm. Debris floated where the ship had been. Survivors thrashed in the cold water. The British ships moved to pick up those they could reach. Captain Lindemann had not left the bridge. Admiral Lütjens, who had commanded the operation, who had made the decisions that had led to this moment, had also chosen not to abandon ship. Both men went down with the Bismarck, a choice that reflected a tradition older than the ship herself, a code that required captains to stand with their vessels until the end. The British sailors who observed this, who saw the German ship roll and sink, experienced something more complex than simple satisfaction at the destruction of an enemy. They had lost the Hood with over 1,300 men. They had pursued Bismarck across the Atlantic in a hunt that had consumed enormous resources and exposed their own ships to danger. But in the moment of the German battleship sinking, there was also recognition of something beyond tactics, something about the nature of war itself, about men bound to steel and fate. The operation that Admiral Raeder had conceived as a decisive blow against British commerce, as a demonstration of German naval superiority, as a way to break the blockade that was slowly strangling the Reich, had ended not in triumph but in catastrophe. The Bismarck was gone. Her complement of over 2,000 men had been reduced by more than half. The Prinz Eugen had escaped and would reach port, but the purpose of the operation had died with the battleship. The Royal Navy, which had faced the crisis of the Hood's destruction, which had pursued through uncertainty and incomplete information, which had assembled overwhelming force and brought it to bear with precision and courage, had succeeded. Yet success in war is often a hollow thing. The ships that had sunk the Bismarck now turned toward home, their engines running low on fuel, their magazines depleted of ammunition, their crews exhausted by days of tension and action. The Atlantic, having taken the Bismarck, remained unconquered. The blockade would continue. The war would continue. The battle had been decided, but the broader struggle that had spawned it remained unresolved. In the cold waters where the Bismarck sank, the transition from power to memory had been completed. All that remained was the aftermath. Chapter 14. The Ship That Would Not Sink. As the morning light strengthened on the 27th of May, the silhouettes of two massive warships appeared on the horizon like grey ghosts emerging from a receding storm. HMS Rodney and HMS King George V, the capital ships of the British Home Fleet, had finally closed the distance. Admiral Tovey stood aboard King George V, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the distant shape of the Bismarck. After more than 2 days of pursuit across cold grey waters, the moment had arrived. The German battleship, wounded and trapped by her own crippled rudder, could not escape. British guns would now have their reckoning. At 0847 hours, Bismarck's forward turrets erupted first. Even with her steering jammed, even wallowing in a slow circular pattern that robbed her of precision, she opened fire across a distance of more than 24,000 meters. The British battleships, moving into attack formation, returned fire moments later. What followed was not a duel between equals. It was an execution conducted at industrial scale, a demonstration of overwhelming force meeting a wounded opponent with nowhere to hide. Shells from British guns, each weighing nearly a metric ton, tore across the morning air in deliberate trajectories. The water around Bismarck erupted in columns of spray as rounds found their mark, each impact sending tremors through her hull that the men trapped inside could feel in their bones. The Bismarck's superstructure, already damaged by earlier bombardment, became the primary target. British gunners, having calculated range and deflection with cold precision, concentrated their fire on the German ship's upper works. The forward fire control tower, the very nerve center from which Captain Lindemann and his gunnery officers directed the ship's defense, disintegrated under a direct hit. Fragments of steel and human remains scattered across the burning deck. The ship's main armament, those 8 15-inch guns that had proven so lethal against Hood, fell silent one by one as their crews were killed or their mechanisms destroyed. The German battleship, which had terrorized British shipping and sunk the pride of the Royal Navy a scant 3 days earlier, was now reduced to a floating wreck, her guns impotent, her ability to threaten anything gone in minutes. Yet the Bismarck refused to sink. This was the terrible mathematics of naval combat. A large enough hull, compartmented and designed to resist catastrophic damage, could absorb punishment that would destroy smaller ships and still remain afloat. Shells punched through her armor belt. Some exploded on impact, others detonated after penetrating deep into her structure. The ship developed an increasing list to port, her starboard side rising higher with each passing minute, as water flooded compartments designed to withstand pressure from external sources, but not coordinated assault from multiple directions. Her upper works became a world of twisted metal and raging fire. Smoke rose in thick columns that could be seen from more than 30 kilometers away. Yet still she floated. Still she had enough buoyancy in her reinforced hull to keep her from sliding beneath the surface. Below decks, in spaces designed for over 2,000 men during normal operations but now crowded with survivors of earlier damage and men attempting last-ditch repairs, the experience transcended human vocabulary. The compartments were pitch black, except for emergency lighting that flickered on and off as electrical systems failed. Water rushed through ruptured seams and flooded through openings torn by explosions on decks above. The noise was overwhelming, the scream of tortured metal, the roar of water cascading down companionways. The thunder of distant explosions felt more than heard, the cries of wounded men echoing in corridors filling with toxic smoke. Men who had trained for years, who had drilled for emergencies, who understood naval combat in theory, now faced the reality of being trapped in a sinking steel tomb, with no certainty of escape and no control over their fate. Some attempted to reach upper decks. Some knew it was hopeless and accepted what was coming. Others worked by reflex, continuing their duties even as the ship died around them. The British bombardment continued with methodical relentlessness. Tovey had authorized his gunners to use ammunition freely. This was the moment for which the Royal Navy had searched across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Rodney, her guns speaking in deep, commanding tones, poured shells into the stricken battleship at a rate of nearly 2 every minute. King George V matched her fire with equal precision. Cruisers on the flanks added their smaller caliber guns to the chorus of destruction. The German ship became a gallery of horrors, fires consuming whatever remained of her upper structure, explosions erupting from deep within her hull integrity compromised in multiple locations, her list increasing so dramatically that men on her deck could barely maintain footing. She developed a slow, sickening roll, as if the great mass of steel and machinery, no longer properly balanced, wanted only to capsize and end the agony. At approximately 0900 hours, after less than an hour of sustained bombardment, Bismarck's guns fell silent completely, not through any coherent decision, but simply because the men to serve them were dead or incapacitated. The ammunition supply was cut off, the fire control systems destroyed, or the guns themselves damaged beyond operation. She had fired perhaps 130 shells in her final battle. Her guns had struck nothing of consequence. She had scored no hits against her attackers. The great battleship, which engineers had claimed could survive practically any damage short of a direct hit from aerial bombs, had proven vulnerable to exactly the kind of coordinated surface gunfire that the architects of capital ships had theoretically prepared her to withstand. But theory meant nothing now, only the weight of steel and fire that continued to descend upon her. The situation became increasingly surreal as the bombardment continued. Bismarck was already defeated. Everyone could see this, the British commanders included. She had no guns that could respond effectively, no speed that could carry her away, no hope that rescue might arrive, yet she remained afloat, a vast floating hulk that stubbornly refused to sink. The British gunners, running low on ammunition and fuel, continued firing not from tactical necessity, but from a kind of grim determination to finish what they had begun. Some British officers considered ramming, using the bulk of their battleships to physically push the Bismarck beneath the surface. The very suggestion underscores how unusual the situation had become. Here was a modern capital ship in the final minutes of her existence, still floating, still requiring disposal, still consuming the resources and attention of the enemy forces around her. The fires aboard Bismarck grew more intense as ammunition magazines detonated and fuel reserves ignited. Her superstructure had become an inferno. The smoke that rose from her was so thick that at times it obscured her hull from view. Men were abandoning ship now, scrambling down ropes and netting toward lifeboats and rafts. Some jumped directly into the water, accepting the risk of drowning or hypothermia, rather than remaining aboard a dying ship. The sea was cold. The waters of the North Atlantic in late May offered no comfort, no mercy to men in the water for more than a few minutes. The Bismarck's crew, numbering more than 2,000 at the start of the operation, faced a choice between an almost certain death aboard ship or a probable death in the sea. Many chose the latter. The German ship's increasing list meant that soon evacuation would become impossible. Her decks would tilt beyond the angle at which any man could stand, and the sea would simply rush in through every opening. The pumping systems that might have fought the flooding had been destroyed, or were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of water entering the hull. The compartments that had been designed with such care to limit damage now created a maze of flooding zones, each one contributing to the catastrophic loss of buoyancy. The Bismarck's bow, still marked with her pennant number and the swastika that identified her nationality, swung higher and higher into the air as her stern settled deeper into the sea. She had begun, at last, to sink. But this would not be a quick disappearance. This would be a slow, rolling death that the men still aboard could watch approaching with absolute clarity. In the final minutes, Captain Lindemann made his decision. He had commanded the Bismarck through her trials, and her triumph and her agony. He had given orders that sent Hood to the bottom. He had felt the impact of British shells tearing through his ship. He could have made his way to a boat, could have joined thousands of survivors in the water, could have lived to face judgment and imprisonment. Instead, he walked into the flames engulfing the bridge. Some accounts suggest he remained in the captain's quarters. Others claim he was last seen standing on the forecastle, facing forward, as the ship continued her death roll. Whatever the precise details, and the chaos of the final moments makes certainty impossible, the captain did not leave his command. He remained with the Bismarck as she sank. Admiral Lütjens, commanding the operation from the beginning, perished in similar fashion. Whether he was killed by British shellfire or whether he, like Lindemann, chose not to abandon the ship remains historically unclear. What is certain is that he did not survive. The men who had conceived and ordered Operation Rheinübung went down with their flagship. This was not the chosen outcome of German naval doctrine, but it was the outcome these men received. At approximately 1:01 hours, the Bismarck's hull, now listing so dramatically that her keel was nearly exposed, finally lost its battle against the sea. The massive ship rolled further, her bow plunging downward, her stern rising higher still. The tremendous mass of steel, oil, machinery, and the remains of her crew slid beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. The greatest battleship Germany had ever constructed, the ship that had been designed to dominate the seas and terrify her enemies, disappeared into approximately 4,800 meters of water. She was gone completely in minutes, the ocean closing over her as if she had never existed at all. The British warships, still firing into the spot where she had been, fell silent, as there was no longer any target to strike. What remained was the sea, and the survivors, both German and those who would soon attempt rescue, left to contemplate the extraordinary fact that such a massive thing had been destroyed, but that destruction had taken an unconscionable amount of time and resources to accomplish. The morning of the 27th of May had arrived with apocalyptic fury. For hours, the Bismarck had endured a battering that no ship, no matter how heavily armoured, could withstand indefinitely. The British battleships HMS Rodney and HMS King George V had poured thousands upon thousands of shells into the German vessel at ranges that afforded her no realistic chance of escape or adequate defence. Her superstructure had become a twisted world of burning steel and torn metal. The proud turrets that once housed her 8 15-inch guns had been reduced to smoking ruins. Below decks, the ship had begun to fill with seawater through countless ruptures in her hull, yet still, impossibly, she remained afloat, a vast mass of steel that seemed to defy the very laws of physics and warfare. The question that now consumed both the Germans still aboard and the British officers observing from a distance was not whether Bismarck would sink, but how long she would endure before the sea finally claimed her. In the chaos of those final hours, decisions were being made that would echo through history. The command structure of the ship had effectively ceased to exist. Officers were either dead, missing, or isolated in compartments that had become sealed tombs. Communication between different sections of the vessel had broken down entirely. Captain Ernst Lindemann, the ship's commanding officer, had maintained his post on the bridge for as long as humanly possible. He had watched as his crew fought a battle they could not win, against an enemy they could not adequately engage. Reports came continuously of new fires, new compartments flooding, new casualties mounting into the hundreds. The young sailors who served under his command, men many of whom had never seen combat before this operation began, were now either dead, dying, or in the grip of survival instinct that transcended the normal chains of military authority. Lindemann had spent decades in service to the German Navy. He had commanded ships before, had earned respect from his subordinates for his technical competence and his moral integrity. Now, at the end, he faced a choice that would define not only his own legacy, but the very meaning of duty and honor in the final moments of a great warship. Admiral Günther Lütjens, the commander of Operation Rheinübung, occupied a similarly impossible position. Lütjens was a career naval officer who had survived previous operations that had tested his judgment and courage. He had made the decision to press on towards Saint-Nazaire even when the Bismarck had sustained damage in the Denmark Strait. He had ordered the change of course that ultimately placed the ship in the path of the converging British fleet. He had been present throughout the morning battle, receiving reports of mounting casualties and spreading fires. Unlike Lindemann, who commanded the ship herself, Lütjens carried responsibility not merely for the Bismarck, but for the entire operation, for the choices that had placed two German warships in harm's way, with the intention of striking at British merchant shipping. As the morning progressed, and it became clear that the battle was lost, Lütjens too would face his final decision. The records of what occurred in those last moments are fragmentary, often contradictory, shaped by the very trauma that survivors experienced. But the fundamental truth remained. Men of rank and responsibility chose their ends deliberately, with full knowledge of what those ends would entail. The process of abandoning ship began in earnest around 0847 hours. As the British bombardment reached its crescendo, wounded men were helped from below decks where they could be reached, though many compartments were already inaccessible, sealed by fire or flooding, or the simple mechanical destruction of hatches and passages. Officers directed crew members toward the open deck, knowing that remaining below offered nothing but death without hope of survival. The weather conditions added another layer of horror to the evacuation. The sea was rough, the water bitterly cold, water that would kill an unprotected man in minutes rather than hours. Those who jumped from the deck found themselves in a desperate struggle not merely to stay afloat, but to reach the few lifeboats that had been deployed, or to cling to debris, or to move away from the ship before she rolled or sank and pulled them down with her through the suction of so vast a mass, finding its rest on the ocean floor. The discipline that had characterized the Bismarck's crew throughout the operation held even in these final moments. Men helped one another. Officers ensured that junior ratings reached the lifeboats first. The evacuation proceeded with a tragic orderliness that spoke to training, to professionalism, and to the bonds that existed between men who had lived and worked together in the confined space of a great warship. Captain Lindemann remained on the bridge as the evacuation proceeded around him. Eyewitness accounts, preserved from survivors who lived to tell what they had seen, describe a man who seemed almost detached from the chaos surrounding him. He did not descend to the lifeboats or life rafts. He did not attempt to join any organized evacuation. Instead, as the fires spread and the list of the ship became more pronounced, Lindemann made his way through the tilting corridors of his burning command. Precisely what his thoughts were in those moments can never be known with certainty. He was a professional naval officer of the old school, a man who had internalized certain codes of conduct that demanded a captain remain with his ship to the end, or at minimum, accept responsibility for his command's fate with honor. Whether Lindemann possessed personal religious faith, whether he had made peace with the inevitability of what was to come, whether he experienced fear or resignation, or a combination of emotions that no single word can adequately capture, all of this remains locked in the silence of the grave. The surviving crew members who were questioned after the war described seeing their captain for the last time moving toward the flames that were consuming the forward sections of the ship, his uniform still immaculate despite hours of combat, his bearing still erect despite the rolling motion of a dying vessel. Admiral Lutyens faced his own final moments with similar stoicism. The reports and survivor accounts suggest that Lutyens, unlike Lindemann, may have attempted to reach the upper deck at some point during the evacuation. Yet he too did not make his way to the lifeboats. One account preserved in the historical record suggests that Lutyens was last seen on the compass platform near the bridge, apparently working at or near the radio equipment. Whether he was attempting to send a final message to German naval command, whether he was receiving orders or information, whether he was simply maintaining his post as commander of the operation until the very end, these details are contested by historians. What is clear is that Lutyens, like Lindemann, did not survive the sinking. His body was never recovered. The German service records, as compiled after the war, list him as having perished with the ship, and this conclusion is supported by the testimony of those few crew members who were in proximity to the command areas during the final moments of the Bismarck's existence. The question of whether the Bismarck was scuttled, deliberately sunk by her own crew through the opening of seacocks or the detonation of internal charges, has remained one of the most contentious points in the historical literature surrounding Operation Rheinübung. Immediately after the war, German survivors offered conflicting testimony. Some claimed that they had personally witnessed the opening of compartment doors to allow water to enter the ship and accelerate her sinking. Others testified that they had heard the order to scuttle, or that they understood such an order to have been given. Still others could not speak to the matter with any certainty, having been below decks when the final events occurred, or having been engaged in evacuation efforts, and therefore not in a position to observe what was happening in other parts of the vessel. The British, having observed the Bismarck's behaviour during and after the bombardment, offered their own interpretations. The official British naval reports and the accounts of British officers who witnessed the sinking acknowledge the possibility of deliberate scuttling, but do not conclusively establish it. The question became almost immediately politicized. In Germany, the narrative of scuttling suited a particular post-war mythology that emphasized the dignity and determination of German sailors who had chosen to end their ship rather than see her captured. In Britain, and among Allied observers, the emphasis fell more heavily on the collective effect of British gunnery, torpedo damage, and the cumulative structural damage to the ship's hull. The evidence available to historians remains fundamentally ambiguous. The damage sustained by the Bismarck over the course of Operation Rheinübung was catastrophic and comprehensive. The torpedo strike from the Ark Royal's aircraft had jammed her rudder, rendering her steering mechanisms inoperable and forcing her into a helpless circular course. The gunnery hits from HMS Prince of Wales in the Denmark Strait had damaged her fuel systems and ruptured her forward bunkers. The sustained bombardment from HMS Rodney and HMS King George V had torn open her hull in dozens of places, killed thousands of her crew, destroyed her weapons systems, and set fires that were beyond the ability of her crew to extinguish or control. The cumulative effect of this damage was unquestionably sufficient to sink the ship. The British gunnery alone, measured in thousands of tons of high explosive and steel delivered directly into the German vessel, could account for her sinking without any need to invoke deliberate scuttling. Yet the question persists because the Bismarck's final descent into the water occurred relatively quickly once she began to sink in earnest, and because certain survivor accounts seem to describe deliberate actions taken to accelerate that process. The historical consensus, as developed by naval scholars and military historians over the decades since the war, has moved increasingly toward the conclusion that while some form of scuttling may have occurred, possibly the opening of certain compartment doors in sections already abandoned by the crew, the primary cause of the Bismarck's sinking was overwhelmingly the accumulated damage from British weapons. The ship's chief engineer, Gerhard Unack, who survived the sinking and lived for many decades afterward, provided testimony that seemed to support this view. Unack described the state of the ship's engineering spaces in the final moments: massive flooding, fires in multiple compartments, the structural integrity of the vessel already compromised beyond any hope of repair. Even if no deliberate scuttling had occurred, the Bismarck was sinking. Whether the process occurred somewhat more quickly as a result of last-minute decisions by surviving officers remains an open question, but it is not the determining factor in understanding how the ship came to her end. What matters most historically is not the precise mechanism by which the Bismarck sank, but rather what her sinking represented and what it symbolized to those who witnessed it, experienced it, or learned of it after the fact. For the German Navy, the loss of their most powerful warship, a vessel that represented the technical achievements and the aspirations of the entire German naval program, constituted a profound strategic defeat. The operation that had been conceived as a bold thrust against British commerce had instead resulted in the destruction of the only battleship large enough to prosecute such an operation effectively. For the British, despite the terrible loss of HMS Hood and the shock of that loss, the final sinking of the Bismarck represented the vindication of their strategic commitment to hunt down and destroy the German threat to their merchant shipping. The emotional resonance of Bismarck's ending was magnified by the manner in which she sank, not in some distant, impersonal catastrophe, but in a direct engagement with British capital ships, where her fate was visible to multiple witnesses on both sides. The deaths of Lindemann and Lutyens became central to the mythology that developed around the Bismarck in the immediate post-war years. In Germany, both men were portrayed as martyrs to duty, commanders who had chosen death over dishonor, captains who had gone down with their ships in the finest traditions of naval service. This narrative served a particular psychological and cultural function in Germany in the years immediately following the defeat of the Third Reich. It offered a way of understanding the Bismarck's destruction not as a humiliating failure, but as a tragic inevitability, a moment in which honor and courage could still be displayed, even in the face of overwhelming military defeat. The fact that neither Lindemann nor Lutyens had the opportunity to influence the final outcome, that both were caught up in circumstances largely determined by decisions made months or years earlier, was secondary to the manner in which they met their ends. The historical record, so far as it can be determined, supports the conclusion that both men faced their deaths with composure and without panic. Whether this composure extended to active participation in hastening their ship's end, or whether it manifested instead as a resignation to inevitable fate, cannot be determined with certainty from the available evidence. The truth of the Bismarck's final moments lies somewhere in the space between these competing narratives, neither pure heroism nor pure catastrophe, but rather the collision of individual human choices with the overwhelming impersonal force of military technology and military conflict. The scuttling question, so far as it can be resolved at all, points toward a more complex reality than simple yes or no answers can accommodate. Very likely, some actions were taken by surviving crew members to hasten the ship's end, actions that might reasonably be characterized as scuttling or as simple acceptance of the inevitable, depending on one's interpretation. Very surely these actions, if they occurred, made minimal difference to the eventual outcome. The Bismarck would have sunk regardless. The sea would have claimed her within minutes or hours either way. What mattered was that she sank, that the operation had failed, that German naval ambitions in the Atlantic had died with her. The myth that formed around her sinking in the years and decades that followed became more important in certain contexts than the precise mechanical details of how she came to rest on the Atlantic floor. But for those who seek historical truth, the evidence points toward a conclusion. The Bismarck was destroyed primarily by her enemies, only marginally, if at all, by her friends. And that distinction, while perhaps small in engineering terms, carries profound weight when considered as a human story. In the confusion and chaos of the night of the 26th of May, as British destroyers closed in on the wounded Bismarck, and her crew battled to restore steering in compartments flooded with seawater and choking